For many years, the tale of Annie Oakley has been recounted, published, and republished, with numerous videos and television shows created about her life, and the information presented has often been accepted as accurate. However, the truth is that much of this information is false. Shirl Kasper, who authored a highly acclaimed and remarkable book on Annie Oakley's life, has recently released an afterword in 2023 that outlines numerous corrections to the misconceptions held by historians, authors, and society regarding Annie Oakley. In this video, I intend to share the facts about Annie Oakley's life, her journey, her experiences, from her humble beginnings to her entry into the show business and through the end of her life. The works I use for this series are obviously Shirl Kasper's book, another biography that was written by Courtney Riley Cooper, Annie Oakley by Captivating History, an autobiography by Annie herself, and lastly, with the huge help from Ellien, Karen, Brenda, Cathy, and Don from the Annie Oakley Center. Thank you all for your amazing help. Y'all are amazing. Annie Oakley was resolute in her convictions and faced challenges with unwavering strength. This is the true, real-life story of Annie Oakley. Phoebe Ann Moses, which was Annie Oakley's real name, was born on August 13, 1860, to parents Jacob and Susan, in a log cabin less than 2 miles northwest of Willowdale in Partintown, North Star, Ohio. She was the sixth of 7 children. Her father Jacob was 49, and her mother Susan was 18, and they married in 1848. Now the name Moses has been constantly debated, and unfortunately, I don't think we will ever be able to pinpoint to whether it's Moses, Mosey, or something else. Mrs. Kasper says the following: a number of documents now accessible through online databases and other websites point to the veracity of the Mosey, M-O-Z-E-E, or M-O-S-E-Y name, although others remain contradictory. The 1870 U.S. Census for Harrison Township, Preble County, Ohio, lists Annie as Ann, M-O-S-E-Y, though the same years Annie's sister, Sarah Ellien, is listed as Sarah Moses, M-O-S-E-S, in census records for the Darke County Infirmary. In the 1880 census, Annie's younger siblings, John and Huldah, are listed by the name M-O-S-E-Y, Mosey. When Annie's sister Lydia married in 1877, the name was recorded as M-O-S-E-E, as her brother's name in the 1900 U.S. Census spelt M-O-S-E-Y. Annie's mother's name is listed as M-O-O-Z-E-Y on her marriage license to Daniel Brumbaugh, and once as M-O-Z-E-E, and once as M-O-S-E-Y on papers filed with estate John Wise. So clearly, the name is all over the place, so it's hard for historians to pinpoint the exact last name. Though Annie did prefer the name Mosey, M-O-S-E-Y, but her brother John preferred Moses, M-O-S-E-S. Siblings can never just get along, can they? Now let's talk about her parents a bit. Jacob Moses was born on March 1, 1799 to parents William and Elizabeth in Blair County, Pennsylvania. In 1813, at age 14, Jacob may have joined the Ohio militia to fight in the War of 1812, but it is debated among historians. Upon discharge, he went to work for his Uncle John, who owned a tavern on North George Street in York County. Susan Moses was born in 1832 to parents Jacob Wise and Emily Clapper in Frankston Township in the Allegheny Mountains of Bedford County, Pennsylvania, where German Baptist brethren, Dunkards, were numerous. An interesting story about Jacob and Susan meeting comes from Courtney Riley Cooper's biography. I will be paraphrasing because it was written in the 1920s. Jake Mosey turned from the road toward a ramshackle farmhouse in a small valley near Hollidaysburg, Pennsylvania, in answer to the sound of a weeping child. Investigating, he at last found a girl of 12 hiding beneath the stairway, and raising her in his arms, the man questioned her regarding her tears. Her name was Susan, the girl said. Her mother had died some years before, to be followed by a stepmother. Then her father passed away, and the stepmother had in turn married again, thus making the girl a stepchild in a double sense. 2 other sisters had left home, resenting the treatment of alien parents, leaving Susan and a baby to bear the brunt of a lack of affection. Therefore, Jake Mosey, who was about 20 years her senior, went forth in search of the stepfather. When he found the man in the field, he obtained a promise that he would treat the child with more affection in the future. But a short time later, when Jake passed the home, he once again found Susan in tears and resorted to taking the girl to his sister's home to be looked after properly. A few years later, when Susan was 15, Jake, who was consequently about 35, rode to his sister's place. He then asked Susan to marry him, and she said yes. Just a reminder, times were a lot different back then, so the age difference wasn't that uncommon. Sometime in 1855, they moved west from Blair County, Pennsylvania to Darke County, Ohio. Darke County was regarded as peaceful farmland. It had been mostly inhabited by the Native Americans before the Battle of Fallen Timbers, where the Native Americans lost Major General Mad Anthony Wayne in 1794. The Battle of Fallen Timbers took place in a time where the United States military was having great successes against their European counterparts because of their familiar battle strategies, but were suffering immense and humiliating defeats against the guerrilla tactics of the Native Americans. According to ArmyHistory.org, eventually, one senior American officer emerged to lead the Army to victory and end much of the threat posed to American settlers northwest of the Ohio River. Major General Anthony Wayne, who had already established himself as one of the premier officers in the Continental Army, was given command of the Army and led it once again into Indian Territory. Under Wayne's leadership, the results were much different. At the Battle of Fallen Timbers in August 1794, near present-day Toledo, Ohio, Wayne and his combined force of regulars and mounted Kentucky militia routed the Indians and largely eliminated the Indian threat in the Northwest Territory. How did he get the nickname Mad Anthony, you might ask? Well, Wayne replied to General George Washington when receiving orders for a famous nighttime bayonet assault against the British position at Stony Brook, New York, stating, quote, "General, if you give me permission, I'll storm hell itself for you." Now let's get back on topic. It was often reported that Jacob and Susan leased a farm that was later purchased with a mortgage, but that wasn't true. They did lease the farm, but they never owned any land. It is also commonly reported that Jacob and Susan were both Quakers of English descent, but that doesn't seem to be the case. According to Thomas Hamm, who is a professor of history and Quaker scholar in residence at Hurlum College in Indiana, says that though several Quaker communities existed and still do in Miami County, Ohio, and just over the border in Randolph County, Indiana, there was none in Darke County until 1890, and even that was short-lived. Gail Honeyman, interim director of the Brethren Heritage Center located in Brookville, Ohio, notes that the matter of Susan's religious beliefs, quote, seems to have no answer. Susan donned the simple grab typically linked to Friends and Dunkards, indicating her possible affiliation. Jacob, Annie's father, was an avid hunter and trapper. It was the best way for him to put good food on the table for his family, and Annie enjoyed going into the woods with him to learn about hunting and trapping. Her father taught her the ways of the forest, how to make traps out of cornstalk, and how to track rabbits and other small game. She was just 5 years old according to the Annie Oakley Center. Unknowingly, Jacob taught his daughter an important lesson, not only for the family's sake, but for hers. In the winter of 1865, Jacob was driving a team of horses into town to purchase supplies and to have corn and wheat ground up at the mill. Suddenly, the weather turned, and he was caught in a blizzard. In an Annie Oakley biography by Captivating History, she notes in a passage, "That night, my mother kept big logs blazing in the fireplace until the light showed brightly through the windows and penetrated the darkness beyond. The supper table, with its simple evening meal, was left untouched, except that we small children had eaten our ponade, consisting of homemade bread cut into small squares, boiling water slightly flavored with brandy, some maple sugar, and the whole covered with cream." As the night progressed, Mother became more nervous. Small as I was, I can remember her face as she knelt and prayed for Daddy's return. 11 o'clock came, 12 o'clock, and then a wagon was heard. My mother, thanking God between white lips, threw open the door and ran forth into the face of the raging storm. Daddy, with the reins around his neck and wrists where his hands were frozen, sat upright in the seat of the wagon. He did not answer my mother's greeting. Speech was gone. The horses had found their way through the open gate, come to the door, then stopped. They were streaming. The sweat was dripping from them. An armchair with a blanket over it was quickly taken to the side of the wagon. Daddy was extricated from the reins, then lifted down and carried within to the fireplace, but he had reached aid too late. He never walked again. The next march gave me a childhood picture of my first grave in a little cemetery 2 miles distant. A grave and a wooden headboard with the name of my father upon it. Jake Mosey died in March of 1866 at the age of 67 from pneumonia and overexposure sustained during the snowy ride. Annie was just 6 years old. Susan was left widowed and poor, and her 8 children were left fatherless. She was forced to move the family into a smaller home with the children that ranged from ages 15 to 2. They each worked hard in order to provide a meal and provisions for the family to survive. Annie, at just 8 years old, used the skills her father taught her and would trap small game to bring home for family dinner. In her autobiography, Annie talks about this period in her life, writing that mother moved her few possessions and children to a small farm 4 miles away. We small children and she did all the work, but every night, no matter how tired we were, mother washed our hands and feet, brushed and plaited our hair into pigtails, took little John and baby Holdy onto her lap around another little waist each side of her, sang hymns with us and prayed God to watch over us. Annie would then go on to talk about how she would trap game and about the first time she used her father's 40-inch cap and ball Kentucky rifle that hung above the fireplace in their home. I busied myself with traps made from the heaviest corn stalks, laid up like a log house and tied together by strings. After small notches had been cut in each end of the stalks, then covered with small brush, a small trench was cut, one leading a little down and under the lower corn stalk, just large enough for a quail to slip under, the trench leading up again just inside the small house. The trenches were laid with tempting grains of corn, and at the farther end, some grains were scattered. The little brown birds were led into the small house, and each day I found fresh meat for the family larder in my traps. We served them toasted with dressing, fried, broiled, fricasseed, and pot pies, and sometimes they made a nourishing broth. Somehow we managed to struggle along for several years. I remember how I struggled to master the 40-inch cap and ball Kentucky rifle, which I finally did, much to my pride. Though my mother and sisters thought my prowess with a gun was just a little tomboyish, I was just 8 years old at the time. It was because little mother did not think so much of little girls playing with guns, and because I could not let that gun alone, that I did something very naughty. I got the gun down from the rack behind the fireplace when mother was not looking, and went out to practice with it. My little brother, who liked guns too, had helped me drag the big thing down from above the fireplace, and we had sneaked poor Daddy's powder horn too. Brother helped me load the gun, and I know that we stuffed enough powder to kill off a buffalo, let alone a little rabbit. What a kick that old gun had. It flew right back at my nose. I got the rabbit, but my nose was broken. We didn't say anything to mother about our hunting experiences. That night, we were sitting around the fireplace. Little sparks began to sputter around the floor. It was the powder brother and I had spilled from the powder horn as we got it down. Mother said nothing, just got the broom, made of maple twigs, and swept the floor. Then she said, "The next time you must have the gun, Annie, ask me, and we will not spill so much powder." Susan would marry again in 1867 to Daniel Brumbaugh and have a ninth child named Emily. Daniel Brumbaugh would suddenly pass in 1870 and leave Susan once again widowed with now 9 children. Unfortunately, I couldn't find any info on Daniel's death. Susan was a caregiver. She worked hard, but just couldn't seem to make ends meet. She took a job that included housework and cooking for her family that paid $1.25 per week, about $30 today. Susan was then approached by a friend, Mrs. Eddington, that asked Susan if Annie might come to the home to sew and help with the children. and on March 15, 1870, at age 9, Annie was admitted to the Dark County Infirmary, along with her elder sister, Sarah Ellien. This is where she learned to sew and also started to receive her basic education. It was believed that Frank Eddington was the superintendent, but this isn't true. Nancy's husband, Samuel Crawford Eddington, was the superintendent. Frank Eddington was their son and was around 6 or 7 at the time. After 3 weeks at the infirmary, a man came in saying that he wanted a small girl as company for his wife. In her own words, she stated that the man said, "The girl would have no work, except to watch the 3-week-old baby boy." He looked at all the little girls, then asked Auntie about me. When she told him I loved to trap and shoot, he said,
"Why, she should go right home with me. We have quail, squirrel, partridges, pheasant, and rabbits. She could go after him whenever she liked."
I told Auntie that I wanted to go, so she sent a letter asking my mother. The man was to come back for me in 2 weeks and see if Mother consented. She did, and I went away with him. Annie would later nickname this family the Wolves. When talking about the time that she had spent with the Wolves, she states, "All went well for a month. Then the work began to stack up. I got up at 4 o'clock in the morning, got breakfast, milked the cows, fed the calves, the pigs, pumped water for the cattle, fed the chickens, rocked the baby to sleep, weeded the garden, picked wild blackberries, got dinner after digging the potatoes for dinner, and picking the vegetables. Then I could go hunting and trapping." Mother wanted me to come home, but they wouldn't let me. I was held prisoner. They wrote all the letters to my mother telling her that I was happy and going to school. It's clear that these wolves were essentially holding Annie as their prisoner. Lastly, she states, "One night, I nodded over the big basket of stocking I had to darn. Suddenly, the she-wolf struck me across the ears, pinched my arms, and threw me out of the doors and in the deep snow and locked the door. I had no shoes on, and in a few minutes, my feet grew numb. I was slowly freezing to death. So I got down on my little knees, looked towards God's clear sky, and tried to pray. But my lips were frozen stiff, and there was no sound. It was not long, though, before the she-wolf heard footfalls crunching through the snow and opened the door, commanding me to come in. But I could not move, so she yanked me in, pushing me into a chair by the fire. My head sank limp just as a he-wolf entered and demanded to know what was the matter. I tried to answer him, but my tongue was swollen to the roof of my mouth. He tried to stand me on my feet, but I went limp. Then the she-wolf confessed and half-dragged me up the steps to bed. I went into delirium, begging to be let in, and the next morning, I was left to rest for the first time since I had come there, but they did not bring me a thing to eat or drink until I could crawl downstairs. This she-wolf was civil for 2 whole weeks after that. But after that, she resumed her old tactics. I constantly begged her to send me back to my mother. On the podcast series I did on Annie Oakley, I said the name of this family was the Studebackers, and that came from a Beckley Post-Herald article in 1974. This was untrue. Kasper's book has the possible names, but the descendants seem to be living in the area, therefore I will not be naming them. In 1872, Annie would run away from the wolves. One fine spring day, the family was gone. I was ironing a large basket of clothes. Suddenly, I thought, why not run away? I made a package of meager belongings, locked the door, and put the key in a tin cup that sat on a shelf in the spring house, and started. After arriving at the train depot, she writes, "The little coach was almost filled as I entered the train. A gentleman moved over and made a place for me. The conductor came along and asked for a ticket. I told him I didn't have any. 'Have you any money?' he asked. 'Yes, sir,' I replied. 'Where is it, and where are you going?' asked the conductor. 'I am running away,' I said, 'and I have 48 cents in my packet.' The gentleman in the seat took some money from his pocket. He asked me where I was running to. I said, 'I think the county seat.' He told the conductor to come back later. Then he had me tell him the whole story. His face was clean-shaven, and he looked so kind that I did so. He said, 'Why, you'd have some 20 miles to walk through rough roads, and night would come while you were in the deep dark woods. Where would you sleep?' He persuaded me to go to the end of the road we were on, have dinner with him at the hotel, catch an afternoon train, and be at the town nearest my mother's at 3:15. I had my very first hotel dinner with the kind man. Then he took me to the depot, put me on the train, and gave me the price of my half-fare ticket. Then he spoke loudly. "Is anyone in this car getting off at blank?" It doesn't say. An elderly gentleman with a St. Jacob's oil whiskers said that he was. My friend asked him to see that I didn't get off the train before the station, and so he passed out my life. But for years, I prayed to God each night to keep the good man who helped me away from the wolves. When she arrived home, she realized that her family had moved. The kind couple gave Annie a meal and informed her that her stepfather, Daniel Brumbaugh, had died in 1870, and that her mother Susan had moved the family and the new baby girl named Emily into a friend's home named Shaw. Annie would write, "I reached Shaw's about 10:30. It had been 10 miles. They all kissed me and I saw my new baby sister. She put her chubby hand on my face. They adored little sister Emily. She sat in her high chair by his chair, where he was always reading one of his history books. He was a scholar. She slept with him too. She had to climb into the big 4-posted mahogany bed by a little 5-step ladder. I had longed to see this baby sister for 3 years. My mother, continuing her nursing work, was away on a case, and the Shaws begged me to stay with them until Mother arrived. Our home was 5 miles further on. Mother would stop there to see the baby on her way home. So I started school with Melissa and the 2 boys, and was happy for the first time since I left Auntie's almost 3 years before. This is when Annie returned to the infirmary and went back to school. As stated prior, Frank Eddington wasn't the superintendent. His father Samuel was, but he took over in 1871. When Annie first arrived in 1870, the superintendent was a man named William Thompson. Samuel took over after him. While at the infirmary, Annie writes, "I was in school when a tap came at the schoolhouse door. It was a loud rap. The girl teacher started. I was at the blackboard, chalk in hand. Cold beads of perspiration came out on me. The door opened and the he-wolf came in. I just screamed. No! I saw the he-wolf in the schoolroom. Melissa Shaw sprang between the wolf and me and said, 'You cannot take her.' The wolf grabbed her wrist and twisted it until her arm was almost broken. Then he took me by my arm, twisting it until I had almost fainted with pain, and dragged me through the door. He pushed me up near the horse's head, holding me on while he untied the team, and was off as the teacher and Melissa and 2 boys gave chase with a stove poker. The wolf had learned of my taking the train and had trailed me. He had stopped at Auntie Eddington's. Auntie did not tell him she knew I was in Dark County, but he pushed on. He had easily trailed me. I knew that he must pass Eddington's and kept figuring how to escape. I planned to turn a back somersault and leap just as he reached the gate, but it wasn't necessary. I saw a 6'2" figure in the road, Frank Eddington. He spoke kindly, started to unbridle the horses, and just took for granted that he-wolf was stopping for dinner. But he sent me in first, and 2 doors were locked between me and the he-wolf. Auntie greeted me with a kiss and washed me up for dinner. She told me everything was planned, and the he-wolf could not get me. I didn't want to go into dinner, but she thought it best. Henry, the farm superintendent, and Frank sat there, ready for any move. After dinner, Auntie had me go upstairs with her, and the he-wolf went into the living room with Henry, and again locked doors were between us. Then I told Auntie my whole story, and I had Auntie unbutton my little dress and look at the scars on my back where the wolves struck me. "My God, child," said Auntie, 6 months ago, and your back and poor little shoulders are still green. How did you live through it?" "I do not know," I told her. "I could not sit down or sleep on my back for over 3 weeks. I had to milk the cows with my head braced against the cow's flank, but he had to carry the milk in for I could not lift the heavy buckets." Auntie just went to the side door and blew a whistle, and Henry came up at once. Auntie told him the story. Henry just went out and hitched up the wolves' horses at once. Then Auntie took me downstairs. The wolf arose and said,
"Well, we must be going. We have a long way to go. Come, Annie."
Auntie said, "Yes, Mr. Blank, it's time for you to go, but this child remains right here. You are a lucky man to escape Mr. Eddington." The wolf clenched his fist and snarled,
"She's not yourn."
But in the door was Big Henry. He said, "Your team is ready," and the wolf went. Annie may have mixed up Frank and Samuel's name in this, and this is why people believe Frank was the superintendent. But the 6'2" figure in the road was most likely Samuel, the father, and the other big figure was most likely Henry, who was living at the home at the time. Now, it was previously believed that Annie stayed at the infirmary until she was 15 years old and then left, but that is not the case. From Kasper's book, quote, records document that she stayed longer than previously thought, not being discharged until October 7, 1876, when she was 16 years old. Annie wrote fondly about her years at the infirmary. She found nurture under the wing of Nancy Ann Eddington, and worked alongside local women employed by the house to cook and clean. All would have recognized a responsible youngster in Annie, who looked after the spring house, took stock of goods in the storeroom, and became a skillful seamstress. The infirmary paid her to make comforts and pinafores for the girls, a job she took to heart by decorating them with fancy cuffs and collars. After leaving the infirmary in late 1876, she would return home to her mother and Mr. Shaw, who Susan had married in 1874. This is when she took her father's old 40-inch cap and ball Kentucky rifle and the skills he taught her and put them to use. The family was struggling immensely, so Annie took the rifle and started hunting and trapping. She began hunting small game for the Katzenberger Brothers grocery store in Greenville, Ohio, where it was then resold to hotels and restaurants in Cincinnati, 80 miles away. It's commonly believed that this is when she paid off her family's $200 mortgage, but here's the truth behind this. Susan and Mr. Shaw purchased 10 acres of land in Wabash Township for $200 from Ann Woods, and there is no mortgage recorded for this land purchase. The mortgage that the family, with the assistance from Annie, paid off was for a house they constructed on that property. The carpenter had taken out a 13th-month mortgage specifically for the house, not the land itself. When Susan grew concerned about making the payment as the mortgage neared its end around April 1877, this is when Annie intervened and helped pay it off. You'll see in almost every source that this is when Annie Oakley started to become big news among the locals. So much so that John B. Frost, a hotel owner in Cincinnati, had set up a shooting competition with a famous fancy shooter named Frank Butler in 1875. Frost had placed a $100 bet with Frank that he knew someone who could beat him. But Frank did not know who his opponent was, and he definitely wasn't expecting 15-year-old Annie Oakley to walk out. The story goes that the competition was held, and they both shot 24 out of 24 clays. Then Frank missed at 25th, and Annie hit. Then Frank courted Annie and they fell in love. Unfortunately, this story is not true, but we will talk about that in a bit. Mrs. Kasper writes, some writers, when unable to document important incidents of her life, have simply made the story up, as most certainly is the case with the long-told story of how Annie Oakley and Frank Butler met and fell in love in a shooting match in Cincinnati in 1875. But in 1875, the future Annie Oakley was still living at the infirmary in Greenville, Ohio, and Frank Butler had not even begun his stage career. In fact, Annie Oakley got her start on the variety stage as a serial comic at Brand's Music Hall on the 23rd of August, 1880. Kasper writes, serial comics were common on the variety stage, usually women looking for a start in show business. They would sing a silly song or perhaps perform a monologue or humorous sketch. That August day, 20-year-old Phoebe Ann Mosey, who had recently adopted the stage name Annie Oakley, performed alone with no mention of firearms or Frank Butler. Previously, it was believed that Annie Oakley did not get her name until later in 1882, but it appears that it was actually earlier. From where she got the name Oakley or how is still unclear. This performance places Annie Oakley on stage 2 years earlier than previously thought. What stands out even more strikingly is that Frank Butler and his shooting partner, Samuel Hyde Bauman, had performed at Brand's Music Hall that very July, just a month earlier than had Annie Oakley. So the Annie Oakley we all know and love didn't start as a sharpshooter, but instead, a singer. Now let's talk about Frank a bit. It was also previously believed that Frank immigrated without his parents and worked a bunch of odd jobs, but Kasper writes, the 1860 U.S. Census documents a 12-year-old Frank living with his parents and siblings and attending school. But he was an Irish immigrant, born in 1847 in County Longford, Ireland, and his whole family immigrated to America in the late 1850s. By 1867, his parents had left Brooklyn for Illinois, but Frank, now a young man, had left for Camden, New Jersey. He was a man of average build, 5'8", with dark brown hair and gray eyes. He worked with glass at one of Camden's glassworks, but he also operated a shooting gallery at the West Jersey Hotel, located at Delaware and Market Street Ferry, coming and going to Philadelphia. Frank also frequented the Stockton Rifle Range in East Camden, where rifle clubs from New Jersey and Pennsylvania, along with the Pennsylvania National Guard, practiced shooting at long-range targets. By then, Frank had established a reputation in Camden, having competed in matches at the Stockton Range and accepting an invitation to take part in a benefit for the out-of-work poor. The attendance was large, and the program was lengthy on that February evening back in 1877, featuring clog and job dances, minstrel songs and farces, typical entertainment for a variety hall. The Daily Post reported, Mr. Frank Butler's rifle shooting was loudly applauded. It was possibly at this time that Frank thought of a different life. He probably became aware of stage shooters such as Samuel Hyde Bauman and his associate Edwin E. Hunn. They adopted the phrase fancy shooting in the summer of 1877 and performed at theaters in Baltimore, Washington, D.C., and Richmond. In November 1877, shooting from 16 different positions, Bauman and Hunn performed at Philadelphia's New National Theater, just across the river from Frank's gallery in Camden. Now, I'm not going to go through each and every detail of Frank Butler's shooting career. This is a deep dive on Annie Oakley after all, but I will hit some key points. On the 26th of November, 1877, the Philadelphia Times announced this performance. First appearance of Mr. Frank Butler and his baseball dog George, introducing wonderful feats of marksmanship, the dog holding the object shot at and doing other clever tricks. 2 weeks later, he appeared in another benefit, this one at the Camden Opera House, where the Daily Post claimed him as our own home famous crack rifle shot. Frank's performance was loudly applauded, and George was his trick dog, looked as proud as a peacock at his skillful master. Frank was becoming more and more popular, and in April of 1879, he partnered up with Samuel Hyde Bauman. The pair traveled around performing all summer, and even traveled to Havana and performed for a week in the province of Matanzas. When they returned home, they took no time off, performing in multiple cities across the eastern United States. It was reported for years that Frank Butler was married to a woman named Elizabeth, but Frank married a young Camden woman named Henrietta Saunders on the 29th of March, 1869. We still aren't 100% sure when Annie and Frank met, but here's what we know. While traveling with Mr. Bauman, they made their way to Cincinnati twice during the spring and summer of 1880. Then, quote, he and Bauman left Cincinnati for Louisville in late May, then visited several towns in Kentucky, Indiana, and Ohio before returning in early July. He did not name the towns, and Mrs. Kasper raises a question. Could one of them have been Greenville or North Star, where Annie's mother lived? But what about the shooting match? That happened, right? Well, the match, as it has been called for 100 years, the famous 1875 shooting competition between Annie and Frank, that didn't happen. But a shooting match did happen. In a newspaper clipping that was kept in a scrapbook made for Annie and Frank. Essentially, Annie and Frank paid a company to find them mentioned in the paper, take the newspaper clipping and put it all in a scrapbook and then give it to them. Because they traveled so much, it made perfect sense. But these clippings are in the possession of the Annie Oakley Center, and they were kind enough to send them to me. According to a few articles that are from an interview that Frank Butler gave, I'm going to piece them together to give the most accurate account I can. From the article titled, Shoots Against an Unknown. In 1881, not 1875, I was shooting with a show and meeting all comers on the outside with my shotgun. With my partner, we left Pittsburgh one day for Cincinnati. Our specialty was shooting peanuts off of each other's heads with pistols, at glass balls and live birds on the outside. I took a back seat for none, save Borgatus and Carver. On reaching Cincinnati, we put up at a hotel where farmers stopped. Some of the guests heard we could shoot. and soon I was tackled by one who wanted to know what I could do. I told him I could be anything then living, save Carver or Borgatas. He said that he had an unknown who would shoot me at Greenville 10 days from that time, for $100 a side. I laughed and took the bet. It seemed a shame for me to take the money from these country people. I thought they were some country people who thought someone could shoot a little, and were ready to lose money, and as I needed it, I went out. In an article titled, How Frank Butler Lost and Won. From the day this match was made until I went up to Greenville, I heard nothing more regarding the match. Greenville was 18 miles from the nearest station, but I started cheerily, thinking I could well afford to do so for the $100 and some more I could get. Surely someone would bet on this unknown. Then finally, from an article titled, He Finds a Little Girl, from the Pittsburgh Dispatch on the 4th of February, 1903. I got there late and found the whole town, in fact, most of the county out ready to bet me, or any of my friends to a standstill on their unknown. I did not bet a cent. You may bet, however, that I almost dropped dead when a little slim girl in short dresses stepped out of the mark with me. I then knew I was to shoot against Annie Oakley, of whose childish prowess I had heard in a faint way. I was a beaten man from the moment she appeared, for I was taken off guard. I never shot better in my life. Never were the birds so hard for two shooters as they flew from us. But never did a person make more impossible shots than that little girl. She killed 23, and I killed 21. It was our first big match, my first defeat. We aren't 100% certain if this was the first time, but if I'd have put my money on it, this would be when Annie and Frank first met. So no, the famous shooting match where Annie and Frank both shot 24 and it came down to the last shot, that's not true. That's a Western legend. But a match did happen, just not in 1875 as originally thought. Now let's get back to Annie's start in variety shows. 2 months after her first performance at the Brand Music Hall in 1880, she traveled, most likely by train, to Indianapolis and performed for a week as a serial comment at Gilmore's Zoo Theater. Gilmore's was a popular place in the 1880s, its zoo boasting 500 wild animals and curiosities, and its theater advertising, quote, first-class vaudeville entertainment. After the week at Gilmore, Annie returned back to Brand's Music Hall. When Bauman and Butler returned to Cincinnati in January and opened at the Coliseum with a novelty troupe consisting of 20 artists, one of whom was Pauline Alms, Bauman's wife, who sang and danced as part of the Olio. The New York Clipper did not name all 20 artists in the troupe, but Annie Oakley may well have been among them. She was definitely among them a month later, when the same company opened on February 21st, 1881, at Brand's Music Hall. The Clipper listed members of the troupe as Bauman and Butler, Annie Oakley, Pauline Alms, and others. This notice is the first time Annie and Frank are found playing the same theater on the same date in the same company, which leaves no doubt that they had met sometime before the winter of 1880 and 1881. It's also unclear how intimate they were in the early time of knowing one another. As surprising as it was for Annie Oakley's name to surface on the variety stage, it vanished just as unexpectedly for a span of 7 months, from May to November 1881. The significance of these dates are clear though, as they align with the 1881 Sells Brothers Circus Tour, which Bauman and Butler had joined for that season. On the 9th of May, during the circus's stop in Quincy, Illinois, Frank penned a poem titled Little Raindrops and sent it to Annie. There's a charming little girl, she's many miles from here. She's a loving little fairy, you'd fall in love to see her. And you bet I love this little girl, with the raindrops in her eyes. This notable poem not only affirms Frank's affection for Annie, but also implies that their relationship had evolved beyond mere friendship by May 1881. What is indisputable is that 2 months after the conclusion of the Sells Brothers Circus season on the 25th of October, Annie returned to the variety stage, sharing the lineup with Frank Butler. They were performing in Cincinnati at the Vine Street Theater the week following Christmas, although they had not yet formed a partnership. In fact, Frank had parted ways with Bauman and taken on a new partner, John Graham. The reason Bauman and Butler disbanded is unclear, as it was never reported or written down by either of the men. But my thoughts? there's a pretty clear event as to why they split up. Quote, "An incident that occurred during the Cell Circus season may have been a contributing factor. During a performance in Milwaukee on May 23, 1881, Frank made an errant shot that struck Bauman in the head. They were standing at a distance of 20 paces, Frank trying to shoot an apple off Bauman's head when the accident occurred. The bullet struck just above Bauman's right eyebrow. He had laid insensible for some time afterward," the Chicago Tribune reported, "but was resting easy when the circus left for the next town at midnight. If my partner shot me in the head, I'd probably want to split up with him too." John Graham was originally from Erie, Pennsylvania, where he and his parents, Jacob and Catherine Graham, were involved in the hotel business, having operated the Lone Fisherman's Inn, a well-known fishing and shooting resort for a period. John Graham was the Police Gazette shooting champion, where a man named Richard Fox had sponsored matches. When Fox learned that Frank had lost his partner, Fox made a team. By December 1881, Graham and Frank had officially teamed up as the Police Gazette rifle team for the Sells Brothers Circus. In the early months of 1882, Annie frequently shared the stage with Graham and Butler, but as a serial comic rather than a fancy shooter. We find them performing at Cincinnati's Coliseum Opera House during the first week of January, where Annie sang comic songs while Graham and Butler showcased their rifle shooting. They then moved on to Indianapolis, where Graham and Butler took the stage at the Buckingham as part of the Jolly Pathfinder combination before heading to Gilmore Zoo, with Annie Oakley listed on the program. Although Frank and Annie were performing at the same venues, the partnership of Butler and Oakley had not yet formed. Throughout the winter and spring of 1882, it was still Graham and Butler who promoted themselves as champion all-around shots. Then on the 15th of May, 1882, the first mention of Butler and Oakley had surfaced in the media when they were to open at the Park Theater in Toledo. Butler's partner, John Graham, had fallen ill, and Annie stepped in to hold the objects. But Annie later wrote, "Mr. Butler's partner was ill, and I went on with Mr. B to hold the objects while he shot, as he thought, but rebelled. No, I want to fire every other shot, I told him." But this may not be true. According to Don Wagner from the Annie Oakley Center, Graham left the team in May 1882 to take over the Police Gazette offices in Conestoga, New York, and this is when Annie replaced him. Richard Fox then made Butler and Oakley the Police Gazette rifle team on the 9th of December, 1882, and this is when Annie received her first gold medal from Fox. One of the final acts of Graham and Butler was on the 7th of June, when they had performed at the Beekman's Hall in Napoleon, Ohio, but it drew a thin crowd. From then on, Frank Butler would only perform with Annie Oakley. Frank recounts the story, while adding some flair for the dramatics, of a time at a particular show that he was missing a lot of his shots. Suddenly, a big burly spectator staggered to the ring and pointed towards Annie and shouted, "Let the girl shoot!" But Annie had never practiced a shot. She picked up the rifle, fired, and missed the first shot. The crowd encouraged her to try again. She takes a deep breath and takes the second shot and hits the target. The crowd erupted into cheer. Frank tells that when he attempted to resume his act, he was howled down and Annie Oakley continued. Frank established a company named the Merrymakers, with their first trip being a tour of Upper Michigan. Frank wrote a letter to the Daily Post, stating that the show started by boat up through the lake regions and the northern section of the state. The Merrymakers' first shows were at Osceola and Ausable on the Lake Hero, in such a wild area that Frank remarked, "Our slumber was often disturbed by the howling of wolves." They sailed to the head of Thunder Bay, then to Petoskey on Lake Michigan, and continued on to Sheboygan, St. Ignace, and Mackinac Island. As usual, Frank's report was filled with details. He described Alpena as deer country, and noted that Petoskey was named after an Indian chief, and Mackinac Island to be the finest summer resort in the country. What Frank did not mention was that the Michigan tour had actually started in Detroit, and that Annie Oakley was present, obviously replacing Graham. He also didn't mention that before embarking on their journey, he and Annie had gotten married across the Canadian border in Windsor, Ontario, a place that likely was due to his previous marriage in the United States. It was previously believed that they got married in 1876, and it was lightly mentioned that they got married in 1882, and was pushed to the side as a rumor because of the long belief of the 1875 shooting match. Well, in this rare case, the rumor turned out to be true. Mr. Frank Butler and Mrs. Frank Butler were married in 1882. One of the earliest recorded instances of Butler and Oakley performing together originated in Jackson, Michigan, located just 82 miles from Windsor. On the 24th of June, 1882, merely 4 days after they wed, the Jackson Citizen Patriot stated that Butler and Oakley were the crack shots. They were set to perform at the city's upcoming 4th of July festivities. The event would feature a parade, dancing, and fireworks, along with a matinee and evening shows by the Merrymakers at Jackson's Union Hall. The Merrymakers delivered an entertaining performance that showcased a banjo soloist, a jolly Irish couple, 2 comedies, and Annie and Frank's fancy shooting. During the Michigan tour, Annie and Frank showcased their talents in the second half of the Merrymakers show, with rifles that were Stevens .32 caliber, with shots being fired from the full length of the stage. According to the Alpena Argus, their expedition featured shooting glass balls, extinguishing candles, and shooting the tip of a cigar held in someone's mouth. The article noted, the lady used the rifle both in the usual position and with the sight turned toward the floor. She also used the rifle with her back toward the target and sighted by means of a mirror. While Frank performed more difficult shots, he would bend over backwards and thus snuff a candle with a ball, fire from beneath his legs, and ended by shooting a mark placed on the head of Mrs. Oakley, the ball exploding in the discharging of a rifle which was placed on a rest above her head. Their show was entertaining and dangerous, and they would wow crowds night after night. There is little doubt that Frank had taught Annie about shooting and acting. As much as they were sharpshooters, they were more importantly performers. Just because a person could shoot well doesn't mean they could entertain a crowd. But Frank would never take credit for teaching Annie, stating that I didn't teach her to shoot. I simply got her a position, and she did the rest. But Annie would say otherwise, saying, I owe whatever I have to his careful management. Frank was the organizer, promoter, and knew the variety stage that would set up Annie for success. Without Frank Butler, there would be no Annie Oakley. That being said, Annie loved to act. Throughout 1882-1883 and into 1884, Annie sang songs and acted along with performing with Frank as a shooter. They even constructed a play called Our Ranch, which incorporated songs, sensations, quick changes, and their trick dog George. It showcased her shooting skills as well, and the play was received as a frontier sketch and wild western scenes with entertainment arranged around artistic rifle and pistol practice. In February 1883, Annie and Frank were playing at Nashville's Buckingham Theater, and Annie received a huge applause that caused the city's newspaper, Daily American, to write that they had, quote, never seen any gentleman that could surpass her skill, with many people saying that Annie could beat any man in Nashville. Well, there was a man in Nashville who had his pride hurt by these comments, and he challenged Annie to 3 matches at $50 a side, with, quote, the matches to take place at any time and place she may appoint. Though Annie had only been shooting on stage for less than a year, she accepted the challenge. The man's name was Jake Oates. The match took place in a theater full of men, highlighting confidence in her capacity to ignore any criticism aimed at her for defying the gender norms of the time. Though we do not have much info on the match itself, we do know the outcome. Annie Oakley outshot Jake Oates. During these significant yet rarely recorded years, Annie participated in expeditions and competed for prize money, sometimes with Frank and sometimes without him. At a match in Erie, Pennsylvania in July 1883, Annie faced off against 7 men and left a lasting impression on spectators, though she did not have her best day, shooting only 7 out of 10 glass balls and 7 out of 10 clay pigeons. But the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette wrote, "Can Allegheny County produce any lady equal expert with the gun?" In 1884, Annie and Frank joined the Sells Brothers Circus for the season, traveling 186 cities before wrapping up the season in New Orleans in December 1884. But during this season, something memorable happened. On the 17th of March, 1884, the Sells Brothers Circus performed in St. Paul, Minnesota, where Annie befriended Chief Sitting Bull of the Hunkpapa Lakota, who was the victor over George Armstrong Custer at the 1876 Battle of the Little Bighorn. Chief Sitting Bull was the so-called leader of the native tribes, mainly the Lakota and Cheyenne. In most instances of the West, the Native American warriors were not led by one overall leader. Compared to the United States Army, where one major general tells thousands of men what to do, for the Native Americans, the leader of the Hunkpapa band of the Lakota could not tell the Oglala band of the Lakota what to do. They would have their own leader, and they held a council to discuss these matters. But at the Battle of the Little Bighorn, the coalition of native tribes came together, held a council, and decided that Chief Sitting Bull would be their overall leader. In this rare occasion, he led the native warriors in a battle against George Armstrong Custer and the United States military on June 26, 1876. It was a devastating loss for all of America and a monumental win for Native Americans. Although Sitting Bull was still a political prisoner at Fort Yates, he was able to come to town for an appearance and was taken around to different shows and went to the Sells Brothers Circus. He was accompanied by his companions, Rain in the Face, Red Cloud, and Curly the Crow Scout, who is credited with being the lone survivor of the Custer Massacre, as he was a scout for the U.S. Army at the time. According to Courtney Riley Cooper, Sitting Bull endured most of the performance with occasional grunts of waste, indicating his approval or a running undercurrent of common in Sioux with his companions, which gave little indication as to his enjoyment or disapproval. Then at last, the act of Annie Oakley and Frank Butler began, and Sitting Bull sat up with new interest. He could understand guns and shooting and marksmanship. He grunted at the first few efforts and became more engrossed. Slowly his excitement intensified. Finally, as the house applauded one of Annie Oakley's more difficult feats, that of shooting the end of a cigarette held between the lips of her husband, the old medicine man arose from his seat, his heavy arms waving in wild gesticulation. He shouted in Sioux, "Wadanya Cecilia." Wadanya Cecilia translates a little sure shot, and I'm really sorry because I know I'm mispronouncing that. Sitting Bull was impressed with Oakley's shooting, her modest appearance, and her self-assured manner. After some time, Sitting Bull sent a Sioux warrior with a pouch containing $80, about $2,700 today, a large drawing of a buffalo, and a signature to find Annie. He told Annie that Sitting Bull wanted her to be his daughter in the place of the one he had lost. She had also been Little Sure Shot. Annie sent back the money, her picture, and her consent. The ceremony took place in a hotel, a gathering of bee-feathered Sioux who conducted the ritual and pronounced the incantation of the young Annie Oakley. They then broke a stick over her head, and a pipe was passed from warrior to warrior. Sitting Bull then gave Annie a golden nugget, supposed to have come from a lost mine, and at last the dancing began, as a celebration of the addition of Wadanya Cecilia to the Sioux tribe. Annie Oakley was officially a member of the Hunkpapa band of the Lakota. In late 1884, after touring a year with Sells Brothers Circus, the circus arrived in New Orleans for the World Industrial and Cotton Centennial Expedition. It was a huge event. The day before the expedition opened, there was roughly 25,000 people on the streets, with all renting hotels, rooms, any place that was open. The day the circus opened, there were heavy rains and the crowd was not what the circus had hoped for. After 2 weeks of non-stop rain, the circus closed down and the owners decided to head home, but not right away. A few days before the circus finally shut down, and knowing that money would soon end, it led Frank to start looking for ways to make money, and he found a Buffalo Bill's Wild West Show ad in the paper. Buffalo Bill's Wild West Show was a traveling performance established by William Frederick Cody, more famously known as Buffalo Bill. It showcased the American West to audiences and included cowboys, sharpshooters, Native Americans, and had portrayals of life on the frontier, with events like attacks on stagecoaches and buffalo hunts. They had real figures from the West, like Francis Butler Hickok, popularly known as Wild Bill Hickok, and Texas Jack Mahondro. It was the most famous Western show of its time, a global success, and is now known as one of the biggest and greatest shows of all time. But at this time, it had only been around for about a year, and hadn't nearly reached its peak. Frank and Annie had renewed their contract with the Sells Brothers Circus. Their contract may have been an increase in pay, but it didn't start until April. That left 4 months of them being jobless. With Buffalo Bill's Wild West show coming to New Orleans, it was a sign to Frank that they needed to stay put and try to get a job with the show. Buffalo Bill Cody had paid for a ticket on one of the last days that the Sells Brothers Circus would perform before leaving New Orleans. He was impressed by Annie's performance and wanted to meet her and Frank. Frank saw it as a great chance to ask Buffalo Bill for a job. Unfortunately, they were turned down. Buffalo Bill believed that they had enough shooting acts in the show already. But one of the shooting acts in Buffalo Bill's show was performed by Captain Adam Borgadas, who was part owner of the show and who performed with his sons Peter, Henry, Edward, and Eugene, and had ended up leaving the show after the horrible winter they had in New Orleans. This left an open spot for Frank and Annie. Annie immediately wrote to Buffalo Bill Cody, asking for a place in the show, but according to Captivating History, however, Annie wanted a fairly high salary, and Buffalo Bill was already in debt for an estimated $60,000, about $1.7 million today, due to the horrible winter the show had in New Orleans. Cody responded to Annie that her payment demands were rather steep. He was also worried that such a small woman wasn't fit to take over the act that was previously led by Borgadas and his sons. Each of Borgadas' rifles weighed at least 10 pounds, and Cody didn't think a woman of barely 110 pounds could carry, shoot, and use these guns day after day. Annie then asked for a 30-day trial so that she could prove that she could perform. Buffalo Bill agreed to let Annie Oakley essentially have a tryout. They planned to meet up in Louisville, Kentucky on the last week of April. Annie wanted to warm up before their first show in Kentucky. She wanted to practice in the same way that Borgadas performed. Quote, Annie used 3 16-gauge Parker shotguns to shoot 5,000 glass balls in a single day. However, Annie was up for the challenge. She shot 4,772 glass balls in 9 hours, finishing the endurance test by shooting an additional 984 glass balls. She announced this shooting feat as her personal record. When Frank and Annie arrived in Kentucky, they quickly unloaded their bags and guns so Annie could practice before the show. According to Courtney Riley Cooper, Frank and Annie brought a big load of guns into the arena. They noticed a man was sitting there who didn't even acknowledge their presence. Annie picked up her shotgun and started to shoot clay pigeons in the arena. The man who was observing Annie's practice didn't even look the part of the Wild West show, as he wore fancy clothes and carried a slim ornate cane. But as soon as Annie finished shooting, he got up without hesitation to tell her how impressed he was with her marksmanship skills. According to Cooper, this was their conversation. "Your name is Annie Oakley, I take it?" he said. "Yes," says Annie. "Have you a photograph? Something with your gun?" Annie hesitated and looked at her husband. "Why, I haven't anything recent," she states. "Then would you mind if I called a cab and sent you down to have some tintypes taken? My name is Salisbury. I'm Buffalo Bill's partner. I'd rather have tintypes if you don't mind. They reproduce better." "But," says Annie as Salisbury cuts her off, "I'd like to get the letter off today. I think $7,000 worth of printing would be sufficient, don't you?" As Annie made her way downtown, she experienced a profound understanding of its significance. The printing was intended for billboards, her image towering next to that of Buffalo Bill and his Congress of Rough Riders of the world. Annie Oakley stepped into a rehearsal and came out a star. The introduction of Annie Oakley to the life she was about to embrace as a sole white woman in the entire Buffalo Bill's Wild West Company was a typical one for Buffalo Bill and Nate Salisbury, but an enormous one for Annie Oakley. As showmen in every sense, they could not let such an occasion go unnoticed. Therefore, when the parade returned to the grounds, featuring Indians with feathers flying, cowboys in their chaps and sombreros twirling lariats, Mexicans, herdsmen, buffalo ropers, squaws, papooses, and travois, a swift conference took place among the show owners, followed by a bugle call for immediate attention. Quickly, the entire assembly lined up. Nate Salisbury positioned himself beside the woman destined to become the greatest sharpshooter in the world, while Buffalo Bill stepped up on the other side. The colonel lifted his enormous sombrero. "Boys, this little missy here is Miss Annie Oakley. She's come to be the only white woman with our show, and I want you boys to welcome and protect her." Thus, Annie Oakley earned the affectionate nickname, Little Missy. Buffalo Bill is the first to call her that, and he would never refer to her by any other name during the next 17 years she would perform with the show. Annie Oakley recounts that introduction as one of the highlights of her life, saying, "My husband and I were introduced as one of them, the first white woman to stand and travel with what society then might have thought it possible. Every head bowed. I felt something like a wild gooseberry sticking in my throat as the friendly, rough hands covered mine, one at a time as they passed. Then the chiefs, followed by their tribes, passed with how? Waste, meaning all is good. A crowned queen was never treated by her courtiers with more reverence than I by those whole-souled Western boys." Oakley and Butler joined the Buffalo Bill's Wild West show in 1885. At first, the couple performed together as partners, but Oakley quickly rose to fame, and this was a significant turning point in Annie's life and in her relationship with Frank. Until this time, Butler had received the top billing and most of the limelight. But when she became a hit with the biggest Wild West show in the world, it was her name on the advertising posters as champion markswoman. This is when Frank became his wife's manager, promoter, and husband. Quote, "Frank made sure to manage Annie's bookings, talk to theater managers, check the train schedule, count and keep their earnings, and place ads in newspapers to advertise Annie's sharpshooting shows. And Frank settled in well. Always in the background, prideful, eager, he sacrificed gladly, if by doing so he might advance the person whom he worshiped with a sort of love that seems all the stronger when contrasted with its beginnings. With the wandering, roving life which this pair led, the comparatively hasty marriage and unusual courtship." The cowpunchers, fresh from the range and different from the theatrical rodeo artists, regarded the girl with a mix of admiration and fondness. When she showed interest in acquiring their skills, they readily took on the role of teachers. They instructed her in the nuances of lariat use and the Western riding technique, clarifying the practical roots of various costume features that might appear extravagant to outsiders. For example, high-heeled boots were crafted for comfort during extended rides, while wide-brimmed hats offered protection against the sun and rain. Other items, such as bandanas and chaps, had practical uses, like keeping dust at bay and providing defense against the elements. Annie Oakley welcomed this new chapter in her life, soaking up the knowledge from the cowpunchers, which played a crucial role in her future achievements. Her initial experiences with the Buffalo Bill show, influenced by these rugged mentors and the enthusiastic backing of Sioux audiences, molded her identity as a quintessential Western figure. By the time the show became a sensation, Oakley had emerged as a symbol of the Western girl, mirroring Buffalo Bill's portrayal of the ideal Western man. But these were the early days of the Wild West show, displaying the early development stages filled with dreams and challenges. During this time, performances were generally conducted once daily in the afternoon, followed by the arduous task of loading the train for the next city. The travel was often sluggish, resulting in overnight trips that forced makeshift sleeping arrangements for the company. To create beds on the train, 2 seats were modified, and cushions set along them to make a mattress, with each performer taking charge of their own bedding. A sort of amusing/mortified tale highlights the instability of these sleeping arrangements. A young boy who was assigned to prepare the beds found that 2 crucial boards were missing. His quest took him to climb a fence where he found some replacement boards. The following morning, when Annie was still waking up, she noticed something weird. She rubbed her eyes as they began to focus on what she was seeing. Startled, she awoke Frank and screamed for the boy. "Where did you get this board?" she asked. "Why, on the other side of the fence in the last town." "Well, you wrap it up and send it back. What's more, you're going to hear from Buffalo Bill for this." The boy did as he was asked. The board was white with a rounded top, bearing in black letters that read, "Here rest in peace the remains of Joshua Pepper." The life of the performers in Buffalo Bill's Wild West was not easy, often forcing them to take the stage in challenging weather, such as rain and snow, because of the open-air amphitheaters. In spite of these difficulties, Buffalo Bill sought to ensure comfort for his main performers, including Annie Oakley and Frank Butler, by outfitting their private tent with various comforts. The show traveled widely, which was taking a toll on their cherished dog, George, the French poodle that had traveled with, performed with, and been their companion since they met. Mr. Cooper writes in his biography that one day, as Butler and his wife careened through a blinding rainstorm on the way to the train, the old dog faltered and fell. Hurriedly, the pair called a cab and that night sat beside a being that was more than a dog to them. It had been this dog which a backwoods child had used as a shield in writing to a man she loved. This dog who an actor had enlisted as an aid to marriage. George, who had formed for years an integral part of their act, and who had often received as many press notices in the early days as they, passed away that night. His passing led to a touching funeral arranged by the members of the show, emphasizing the strong emotional ties between the performers and their animals. The performers, despite their tough appearances, showed deep sorrow over George's death. The funeral featured a solemn procession, with cowboys and Sioux performers coming together to pay their respects. In the Buffalo Bill Company, there was a freckle-faced boy wearing a large sombrero. His name, much like Little Missy's, was well known as he was recognized as a world's champion male rifle shooter, Johnny Baker. As a boy, he followed a god he never abandoned, viewing Buffalo Bill Cody as the alpha of existence. His home was near the vast, sprawling structure of the Cody home in North Platte, Wyoming, also known as Scout's Rest. When the plans for the first Buffalo Bill show began, Johnny, with the wide-eyed wonder of a child witnessing the unbelievable, attended every rehearsal. Finally, as the show was getting ready to hit the road, he approached the scout and asked, "Please, Buffalo Bill, can I join your show?" Bill Cody looked down at him, ruffled his goatee and his long, heavy hair. Then in a booming voice, "You? Go with my show? Why, blast my skin, Johnny. What can you do with the show?" Johnny hesitated a moment. "Well, I could black your boots." This led to the addition of a freckle-faced boy named Johnny in the Buffalo Bill Wild West show. The boy had always been a favorite of Buffalo Bill, and with one of those typical Cody impulses, he took the boy under his wing and began to guide him on a path as a rifleman. "Might as well learn while you're young." "I did," Cody boomed. That marked the beginning of Baker's journey, inspired by a deity in the shape of Buffalo Bill. Adorned with a massive sombrero that nearly threw him off balance, and with hair growing long like Buffalo Bill's, he practiced daily with both the rifle and the lariat, embodying the boy of the grand spectacle. And Annie Oakley soon became his playmate. Before long, the bond between Johnny Baker, better known as the Cowboy Kid, and Annie Oakley forged through childhood games, evolved into a competitive friendship outside of the arena and a rivalry within it. As Buffalo Bill put it, "Twice a day, rain or shine, the stocky little man and the delicate entered the ring to shoot for the title of the Buffalo Bill Wild West champion." Young boys were the most enthusiastic supporters of these two. Bent arms, hands clasped, and eyes focused, they occupied the general admission seats. No popcorn, no peanuts, and no program. For their sole $1.25 piece had been spent on the general admission ticket, eagerly watching the titanic battle for the supremacy of male over female. Day after day, that championship was contested, and with each performance, the debate was reignited. To older spectators who viewed it merely as a display of skill, it was just an expedition. However, for the youngsters, it felt like a matter of life and death, a battle of the male superiority against a seemingly fragile little woman, compelling Johnny Baker to somehow regain the lead from the girl who was outpacing him. Yet one by one, the glass balls soared into the air, ready to be shattered by the blast of their rifles, with Annie Oakley always winning and Johnny Baker always losing. There's a tale recounted in Cooper's biography about an unnamed man who recalls a significant moment while shooting with the Cowboy Kid. It goes like this. "We found ourselves at the edge of the Badlands in South Dakota, precisely at the location where, in the closing years of the century, Bigfoot and his band of starving, corrupt Sioux warriors confronted the military during the final Indian rebellion, known as the Ghost Dance War, which culminated in the Battle of Wounded Knee. It was a Sunday, and Buffalo Bill was seated at the entrance of his tent. encircled by Army generals from the Indian fighting era, veteran scouts, and Sioux warriors, each competing to share stories from a bygone time. Johnny and I were off to one side, with Johnny holding a rifle and I clutching a handful of $50, gifted by various visitors to our camp, ready to toss them into the air, where they would be struck mid-flight by a shot from Baker's rifle, and then kept as mementos. While engaged in this temporary role of object thrower, a sudden wave of nostalgia washed over me, bringing forth a question that had lingered for years. "Johnny," I inquired, "can you tell me something? When you competed against Annie Oakley and she consistently triumphant, was it because you weren't putting in the effort, or was she simply a superior shot?" Johnny sent another $50 spinning into the air, then turned to look at me seriously over the barrel of his rifle and said, "There was never a day when I didn't try to beat her, but it just couldn't be done. You know, the ordinary person has nerves. They'll bob up on him in spite of everything. He'll notice some little thing that distracts his attention, or get fussed by the way a ball travels through the air. Or a bit of light will get on his sights, or seem to get there, and throw him all off. I wasn't any different from the average person, but Annie was. The minute she picked up a rifle or shotgun, it seemed that she just made a machine out of herself. Every action went like clockwork. And how was a feller ever to beat anybody like that? To tell the truth," Johnny drawled, "it would have made a better show if I could have beaten her every few performances, but it could not be done." From what I could find from several different sources, I tried to piece together how her act went. So it may not be perfectly spot on, but I also believe that the act would change depending on the day or how the crowd was reacting. Her act lasted about 10 minutes. She would enter by skipping into the arena, waving and blowing kisses. Then meet Frank in the center of the shooting stage. She was very animated. It was something unique that many audiences haven't seen. She wore modest clothing, a short skirt that went below her knees, and a shirt that was loose around her waist. She looked like an innocent little girl. She wore a wide-edged sombrero with a 6-point star attached to it, to represent the Wild West characters that were in the show, that became one of her marks. She would unveil the table of weapons she would use in the show. She would then start shooting, whether it was a glass ball filled with feathers or clay pigeons. Frank would throw it up, 1 at a time, 2 at a time, then 3 at a time. Annie wouldn't always hit her targets. She certainly could, but if you remember how Frank would purposely miss on his performance to make the act better later on, Annie did the same. Except when Annie missed, she would stomp around like a little girl throwing a tantrum. Sometimes, she would lay the gun on the ground and walk in circles around it, a way of giving the gun a firm talking to. Then Annie would grab the gun and start hitting again, 1, 2, 3 at a time. Then Annie would start throwing them up herself. She would throw 2 or 3 or 4 targets up, grab a shotgun, shoot 2, grab another, and shoot the rest. She would hit them all before they would reach the ground. Her act then becomes faster and faster and faster until people were at the edge of their seats and things were exploding every which way. She would shoot 2 targets at the same time with 2 guns. She would shoot right-handed, then left-handed. She would shoot the gun upside down, then sideways. She would then turn around and use a mirror to aim and still hit the target. She would then stand a bit away from the shotgun. Frank would throw up a target, she would run to the gun, pick it up, and hit the target before it hit the ground. Her most difficult tricks were when she had 11 targets thrown. She would have 5 shotguns and a rifle, 11 shots, 11 targets, and she would hit them all. One of her favorite tricks was with the rifle. Frank would hold up an ace of hearts and she'd drill it through the center of the heart. Then Frank would hold the card parallel to the ground and she would split the card in half. Her final act was shooting the cigarette out of Frank's mouth. She would then leave the stage, skipping once again while sending kisses to the crowd. Just before she left, she would do a little kick with her feet. She played into the little girl character, and spectators were left in awe of her performance and of her. The 1886 season for Buffalo Bill's show began with high expectations, featuring a summer on Staten Island and an indoor expedition at Madison Square Garden. Performers, including Annie Oakley, prepared extensively, investing in new costumes and equipment. However, during a performance in Washington, D.C., Oakley experienced severe discomfort due to a bug lodged in her ear, which led to significant pain and swelling. Despite her condition, she continued to perform, embodying the adage that the show must go on. Oakley's determination was evident as she endured increasing agony, ultimately leading to an abscess and a dangerous fever. Despite her husband's and others' concerns, she refused to rest, driven by her commitment to the performance. On the day of a highly anticipated parade, she was ordered to stay behind due to her condition, but in true Annie fashion, she ordered, "Bring my horse here at once. Put these vaqueros on him. I'm going in that parade." After the parade, Oakley collapsed in her saddle from exhaustion and pain, prompting Frank to run to her aid and call for the doctor. A medical emergency revealed she was fighting for her life due to blood poisoning. In a small tent, a procedure was carried out that typically necessitated a hospital and an operating room. The intricate task of lancing beyond an eardrum was performed, while through the haze, since no anesthetic had been used, Annie Oakley heard the surgeon declare that blood poisoning had set in, and that she only had a 1 in 12 chance of recovery. "All right," she said, "that'll give me a fighting chance." Quickly, news spread across the expedition grounds that Annie Oakley was battling for her life. The show opened to a full house, many attendees eager to see the famous sharpshooter. The stress management, scrambling for time, opted to announce that the beloved star had suffered an accident but would be back in a week, planning to extend the announcement on her disability for another week, thus delaying the final decision until the outcome was clear, whether life or death. Yet, just 4 days later, a young woman, her eyes so swollen she could hardly see, her gait a blend of dragging steps and aimless swaying, her head wrapped in bandages, entered the arena, leaned against the table that held her guns, performed her entire act, and then warily exited. Annie Oakley had won her battle for life. It was the only time she ever missed a performance throughout her entire engagement with the Buffalo Bills Wild West show. In 1887, Buffalo Bills Wild West toured England to join in the Golden Jubile of Queen Victoria. The show opened that May, and Annie Oakley was the subject of considerable press due to her shooting skills and the fact that she was probably a woman. While there, the show performed for Queen Victoria of the United Kingdom, King Umberto I of Italy, Marie-Françoise Sardy-Carnot, I know I didn't get that right, the President of France, and other crowned heads of state. Mr. Cooper writes that she was the reigning sensation of America and Europe during the heyday of Buffalo Bill's Wild West show. She was their star. Her picture was on more billboards than a modern Gloria Swanson. It was Annie Oakley, the greatest woman rifle shot the world has ever produced. Nobody took her place. But what if I told you, Annie wasn't the only famous woman sharpshooter trying to make a name for herself? Annie Oakley had made her name besting male sharpshooters, and a woman by the name of Ellien Smith represented her first female rival. The rivalry was tense. Smith, being 11 years younger, promoted herself as younger, and therefore more bankable than Oakley. Ellien Smith was a 15-year-old sharpshooting whiz hired by Buffalo Bill in 1886. She called herself the Champion Girl Shot. According to Cooper, the relations between the two quickly deteriorated. One reason was Smith's personality. She liked to brag and could be heard declaring Annie Oakley was done for now that Smith was part of Cody's show. Smith spoke coarsely and wore flashy clothing, both qualities anathema to the more conservative Oakley. In addition to these other shortcomings in Oakley's eyes, Smith was apparently a shameless flirt. The growing feud between the two hit its climax when the show went to London in the spring of 1887. Oakley was apparently criticized in the press for shaking the hand of Prince Edward's wife first, while Smith, who did the same thing, was not mentioned. But Annie explained why she committed this incredibly heinous act that us Americans will just never understand. From her own notes, she wrote, "As the last gun I had used lay on the table, still smoking with heat, the Prince of Wales, who with Alexandria, occupied the lower seat and asked if I might be presented. Our orator, Frank Richmond, who stood at a corner of their box, gave a slight inclination of his head as I bowed to them. I went into the box. What a fine-looking college-bred man our Frank Richmond was. His presentation speech was, 'Your Royal Highness, I have the honor to present Annie Oakley.' I had heard a great deal about how women try to flirt with the prince, while the gentle princess held her peace, and now it all ran before me. An English-born lady would not have dared to have done as I did. They must speak to royalty according to the station of the royal personages. The prince's hand came over the low front of the box as they all arose to their feet. I ignored it and quickly preferred my hand to his princess. She didn't offer the tips of her fingers, expecting me to kneel and kiss them, but took my hand gently in her own, saying, "What a wonderful little girl." Nor was His Highness displeased at what I had dared to do, for he too shook my hand warmly when I turned from the princess to him. And after I had bowed far enough to turn my back, he made this remark loud enough for the whole assembly to hear. "What a pity there are not more women in the world like that one." I'm sorry, my English accent is horrible. On top of Annie being talked down upon for this, although it was Oakley whom Queen Victoria praised when they met, a London illustrated newspaper chose to run a drawing of Smith meeting the Queen instead. And an American newspaper ran a crude letter from a Californian that said Smith was knocking the English shooters crazy while Oakley was being left out in the cold. This was complete BS and not the truth at all, but Oakley still received the majority of praise in the press and from British sportsmen. Prince Edward even wrote a letter to Cody saying, "Dear Sir, will the little girl, Annie Oakley, who shoots so cleverly in your show, object to shooting a friendly match with the Grand Duke Michael of Russia? We will arrive at Earl's Court at 10:30 this morning. Edward." Cooper writes that Oakley had the last laugh where it counted though, on the nearby shooting field of Wimbledon. 2 days after Smith had embarrassed herself with a poor showing, Oakley arrived and shot so well that Prince Edward stepped forward to congratulate her. Now let's talk about this competition with the Grand Duke Michael of Russia. The request from the Prince of Wales caused quite a stir and sparked much debate among the Wild West camp. Nate Salisbury encouraged Annie and told her to go for it, that she could outshoot him. But Bill Cody interjected. "Wait a minute," he said. "There's the problem. She shouldn't outshoot the Grand Duke. That would be awful." The discussion continued with Bill Cody, the showman, holding the belief that one must always act appropriately, especially when a Grand Duke of Russia considered himself a skilled marksman. But in true Annie fashion, with her husband by her side, Annie said, "If what we hear of him is true, I wouldn't have to let him beat me. I'll have to do my best to even tie him." Salisbury, excitedly, said, "Shoot him off his feet." Major Burke, the press agent of the show, wept, as he couldn't imagine being so unkind to royalty. The decision had been made. The Grand Duke of Russia, one of the best shots in the world, for a small-town girl from Greenville, Ohio in America. The match was set. Annie and Frank had learned that the Grand Duke had his best outcomes with clay birds that flew 40 yards from the trap, which was a slower flight than what Annie had set up for him during their match. "We'll just make it a good test," as she instructed the traps to be set at 65 yards. "That'll be something to shoot at." At exactly 10:30 in the morning, as recounted by Annie Oakley, 4 carriages arrived at the grounds. They carried Edward and Alexandra, the Prince and Princess of Wales, George, the Duke of Clarence, who became the King of England, the Grand Duke Michael of Russia along with his entourage, the Princess Louise, the Princess Maud, and one particularly significant figure in the eyes of the Grand Duke Michael, the Princess Victoria of England, daughter of the Prince of Wales. Then, the competition commenced with the victor determined by the highest score out of 50 targets, as the royal party settled into the boxes to observe the contest. Through the first 10 shots, Annie held a narrow lead over the Grand Duke, with the royal audience, the Wild West Company, and reporters on the edge of their seat, clinging to every shot. Annie was calm and executing her shots, and the Grand Duke was fighting hard to close the distance. The great Grand Duke Michael of Russia, one of the best shots in the world, was feeling the pressure. By 30, the margin had grown, and the Grand Duke knew it was looking bleak. By the end of the match, it was a decisive affair. The Grand Duke had missed 14 targets. Annie Oakley had missed just 3. The Evening News and Telephone of London reported a few days after the event. Fame, but not notoriety, is silent about this noble sign of Russia, who is said to have visited this country, not alone for the purpose of attending Her Majesty's jubile, but to find a wife from among the daughters of the Prince of Wales. Whatever may be the faults of the Grand Duke, and reports say that they are very many, he must be credited with a great love of sport of all kinds. And in his own country, he is a great and generous patron of everything connected with sport. Only a day or two ago, he asked to be allowed to enter into competition with Miss Annie Oakley at the Wild West show at Earl's Court, which permission was at once accorded. But although the Grand Duke made a fairly good score, it showed but poorly in comparison with that of his fair competitor, and he retired from the contest abashed, but firmly convinced of the superiority of American markswomen over Russian amateur lady shots. The Prince of Wales held a positive view of the Wild West show and its prominent figures, particularly Buffalo Bill Cody and Annie Oakley. His friendship with Cody led to frequent visits to the show, where he interacted with cowboys and Native Americans, effectively becoming an unofficial royal patron. Their relationship deepened as Cody introduced the prince to American pastimes like poker. Annie Oakley also won the prince's admiration, who helped her gain access to elite sporting circles in England, such as Wimbledon and the London Gun Club. Although she initially struggled with shooting fast-moving targets, she eventually received specially crafted guns that enhanced her skills. The prince acknowledged her talent with a medal, boosting her social standing and leading to gifts and recognition from the nobility, including autographed photographs from the royal family. Unlike her fellow performers, Oakley's education and grace allowed her to navigate high society successfully, transforming her from a modest upbringing in Ohio into a celebrated figure in England. The conclusion of the London season marked a significant disagreement between Annie Oakley and the management of Buffalo Bill's Wild West. It was over a rivalry with Ellien Smith. Though Annie had outperformed Smith, management decided to keep Smith on, which did not sit well with Annie, who had a clear dislike for her. When the show was about to return from Europe, Annie Oakley approached Cody and told him that she was leaving the show unless Smith was fired. When Cody refused, Oakley and Butler left the show in 1887, and Buffalo Bill's Wild West show would return home without Annie Oakley and Frank Butler. During their time in Europe, they participated in private expeditions and shooting matches for a short time. When they returned to America, Annie Oakley announced that she would no longer be performing with Buffalo Bill's Wild West show. She soon signed a contract with a new Wild West show. Annie was signed to become the star of the show, and her and Frank traveled from New York to the showgrounds to get a good look at their new home. When they arrived and saw a group of Indians camped with a large herd of horses and a small group of men who called themselves cowboys, they knew it was not the place for them. Annie writes in her autobiography, stating, "We found 43 picked Comanche Indians encamped on the grounds. Rehearsal was the next morning. It was evident that none of them knew much about riding. Mr. B looked at the way things were going, then said, 'It won't do, Missy. I can't afford to have you connected with a failure.'" The show was being advertised by a ferry boat company along with a wealthy group from Philadelphia, who, as Annie noted, placed their trust in men sporting imitation sets and hats, despite lacking any genuine understanding of the West that their headgear suggested. The cowboys were unable to ride, there was no management in the place, and in fact, there was nothing to suggest that the show would extend beyond its initial performance. Gordon W. Lilly, more famously known as Pawnee Bill, aspired to launch his own Wild West show after years of experience with Buffalo Bill's show. However, he faced significant challenges as he ventured out on his own, primarily from Cody's show, which had gained immense power following its recent success in Europe. The ruthless nature of the entertainment industry meant that only one show could thrive, fostering a competitive environment where management of Buffalo Bill's show actively sought to undermine Pawnee Bill's aspirations. As Pawnee Bill struggled to draw in audiences, he often found his promotional efforts overshadowed by Cody's marketing. Whenever he put up a billboard or hung a poster, it would soon be covered by an ad of the Buffalo Bill show that was to be performed on the same day, leaving Pawnee Bill to gaze at vacant seats. When Frank Butler and one of the show's owners that he and Annie now worked for boarded a ferry, he caught sight of a newspaper headline in the hands of a newsboy that read, "Pawnee Bill show stranded in Pittsburgh." His eyes instantly brightened because he understood what it meant. According to Cooper's biography, he eagerly told the show's owner, "Here's your chance. I can see through this thing. The Buffalo Bill outfit has engineered this in some way. It's an old trick to work up an attachment to get rid of an opposition amusement." Frank advised the owner to head to Pittsburgh, relieve the company of its debt, gather them up, and transport them to Staten Island, where they could regroup and genuinely compete with Buffalo Bill's formidable show, with Annie Oakley at the forefront. There was only 1 week until Buffalo Bill's show came to town, and advertisements were strewn up everywhere stating, "Wait for the big show, Buffalo Bill is coming." Frank, Annie, and the management of the new show were to perform exactly 4 weeks after Cody's show, yet they encountered considerable hurdles, particularly with the logistical nightmare involving numerous performers and acts. But at the heart of the show was Annie Oakley. Despite facing pressure from Nate Salisbury to break her contract and return to the Buffalo Bill show, Annie remained resolute, ultimately becoming the cornerstone of the new show. When the show opened, Annie was at her best. Shooting on foot, on horseback, she gave interviews and displayed the many medals and cups that she had won as a result of her shooting ability. Her performances and public image not only enchanted spectators, but also cemented her significance in the entertainment sector, as she garnered large crowds even while competing against the largest Wild West show the world had ever seen. Meanwhile, Pawnee Bill was utilizing the connections and insights he had gained during this time to advance his own career in the show business. But as time went on, Buffalo Bill Cody's show experienced financial difficulties, which ultimately led to Pawnee Bill coming in to save his old partner from disaster. Annie Oakley found herself in a flurry of activity after her contract with the Wild West show had expired. She quickly moved into vaudeville and even starred in a melodrama called Deadwood Dick. This production, which combined typical Western characters with dramatic themes, aimed to capitalize on Annie's popularity, though she initially was unaware to the marketing tactics involved. The play garnered mixed reviews, with one critic stating, "Regarding the play, the shooting of Annie Oakley was very good." As the production faced financial difficulties and then went under, Oakley came to realize that the endeavor was a poorly constructed money-making scheme, and Annie successfully distanced herself from the project altogether. This is when Buffalo Bill Cody and Nate Salisbury sought to mend their relationship. Annie knew her home was with the show, and the partners knew what must be done. Ellien Smith was let go, and she reportedly ran off with a cowboy and surfaced a year later in the US, with her skin artificially darkened as Princess Winona, the Indian girl shot. Safe to say, Annie Oakley had won the rivalry. But Julia Bricklin, who wrote a great biography of Ellien Smith, writes that Annie's popularity in English society weighed heavily on Ellien, who started to realize that no matter how talented she was, Annie Oakley would always be England's favorite shooter. But before we go on, quick note. They did compete again in 1902, when they both competed in the Grand American Handicap in Kansas City. In the qualifying rounds, Ellien missed 1 bird out of 12, as Annie had missed 2. But in the main events, Ellien missed 3 and Annie missed 2. Annie Oakley was now back with the Buffalo Bill's Wild West show, and when they announced that they would be returning to Europe and performing at the Paris Expedition of 1889, the big announcement of Little Missy came with it. Annie Oakley's return to the show was motivated by mutual admiration and respect. Her involvement was essential for the show's success, and her comeback not only reinstated her reputation, but also boosted the overall allure of the Buffalo Bill Wild West show. The timing of her return proved to be perfect, as it contributed significantly to the tour's success. The expedition of Buffalo Bill's show at Parc des Neuilly in Paris, along with a similar event in London, generated significant buzz. The opening day attracted around 22,000 attendees, including the President of the Republic and prominent artists. However, the grand entrance was met with unexpected silence from the audience, which remained unresponsive despite the impressive turnout. Buffalo Bill exhibited signs of nervousness while Nate Salisbury paced anxiously backstage. Despite Buffalo Bill's dramatic performance, the audience remained stoic. highlighting the initial disconnect between the performers and the audience's expectations. A cowboy that was fresh from a fight with an outlaw horse got off and took a bow for the crowd and didn't receive a single clap. "Sure is cold in Paris, ain't it?" he asked. "Must be a full 10 inches of frost on that audience." The show progressed, but it never got any better. Nate Salisbury turned to the interpreter and told him to go into the grandstands and see what the issue is with that crowd. He then switched the program and sent the act of a stagecoach screaming into the arena with red fire and Sue and Kiowa pursuing it. But again, it was followed by silence. The interpreter returned and gave the news. He said, "Well, these people, they do not understand what it is about. They object to all this pretending." Pretending? Asked Cody and Salisbury. What pretending? The bucking horses, for instance. They feel that it's just a show, because they say if horses were that mean, why would anybody rife them? "They call that pretending?" Cody asked. "Dog my cats, that last cowpuncher came pretty near being killed." This is exactly the case. I told that to the people with whom I talked, and they asked me, "Voila, why should he want to kill himself?" "But the Indians, you'd think that they'd get some interest in the Indians. Don't they know that these are the actual chiefs and braves who fought against the United States Army for the possession of the West? Don't they?" asked Salisbury. "They don't, you see. I brought up that point also, and they answered me saying, 'Mon Dieu, do you expect us to believe that they would actually turn such fierce savages loose to kill everybody in sight if they cared to? It is an imitation,' they say." Cody looked around and shook his head in grave dismay. The issue had surpassed his control. Salisbury scowled, glanced around, and then abruptly moved forward at the sight of Annie Oakley, who was just stepping in to make her entrance, accompanied by her assistant carrying her guns. "Missy, you've got to do something. You're the last card. These Frenchmen out here can't tell a Comanche from a drugstore, or a horse from a walking beam. They think everything in the show is just an imitation. Get out there and prove it isn't." This is one of Annie Oakley's most challenging tasks, performing in front of an audience that displayed little to no enthusiasm. With a resolute spirit, she stepped into the arena, greeting the crowd with only a hint of courtesy. As she commenced her shooting routine, the mood shifted from casual conversation to intense concentration as she executed her rifle tricks. As Oakley continued, she felt the audience's increasing involvement, culminating in a wave of applause following a difficult pistol shot. But Annie remained focused because she knew that she had not yet won them over completely, as some of her tricks could be mimicked by other skilled shooters. Then the pivotal moment arrived when she demonstrated her shotgun prowess, commanding 2 glass balls to be launched in the air at the same time. With her precise shot, she shattered both targets, prompting loud applause from the audience and marking the peak of her performance. This moment not only strengthened her bond with the crowd, but showcased her extraordinary skill. "By God, Bill, she saved the show," Salisbury said. Gunwork was what the French audience knew, and Annie Oakley mesmerized them with her performance. Almost every man in the crowd had served his time in the French army, and many were sportsmen themselves. But Annie was not finished yet. She performed the trick of laying her gun down on the table, jumping over the table to spring 2 birds from a trap, and shooting both before they hit the ground. Every trick she had, she pulled out now, and the crowd got louder and louder with every shot. She then took a bow to the crowd and exited the arena with hats being waved, and the crowd rose to their feet and began cheering and shouting "Bravo" and "Viva Annie Oakley." As she exited, Salisbury pushed her back to the entrance and said, "Go back and give him some more." She would exit and come back a total of 5 times before finally retiring from the arena. Annie writes, "As the cheers kept up, I ran to my room, made a complete quick change, jumped onto my wild little horse, Billy, and away we went around the arena at full speed." Miss Oakley's participation in Paris reflected her achievements in England, earning her even greater admiration from the crowd. She became a renowned personality, receiving a multitude of invitations from elite shooting clubs, including those linked to European royalty. While in Paris, she encountered Sadi Carnot, the president of France, both in the shooting arena and at his palace. Their farewell conversation suggested a possible military career in the French army, which was framed as an appealing prospect. The Wild West expedition drew significant dignitaries, such as the Shah of Persia, the Sultan of Turkey, and Dina Salifou, the King of Senegal. The King of Senegal took a special interest in Miss Oakley's performance and sought Buffalo Bill for a rather peculiar request, according to Mr. Cooper's biography. "How much do you want for her?" the King asked. "Want for her? How do you mean?" was questioned by Buffalo Bill. The King responded, "To sell her. I wish to take her back with me. In my country, my people are not safe in many of the small villages. There are man-eating tigers in many districts, and even one of these animals can cause much damage. But with a person of such wonderful skill as she, it would be easy to organize parties with her as the chief huntress. The danger would soon be past. Would you consider 100,000 francs sufficient?" The eyes of Buffalo Bill lit up, but only from the humor. He then wanted to have some fun at the King's expense. He then called for Annie and told her, "Missy, I've got an awfully good offer for you here," as he introduced her to the King of Senegal. "His Majesty would like to pay you for 100,000 francs to go down to his country and shoot man-eating tigers." "But am I for sale?" asked Annie in a serious tone. "Come to think of it, I guess you ain't," Cody responded. The King then raised his price and begged Buffalo Bill to release his slave. "Slave? She isn't my slave. She's the one to say whether she wants to go down there or not." When the King realized his mistake, he apologized, but still begged Annie herself, but failed. Annie would write, "When I told him I did not wish to go, he went down on one knee with a sweeping grace that would have done credit to the ye knights of old England, and lifting my hand, raised my fingertips to his lips. He departed with the air of a soldier." The stay in Paris lasted until November, and went to Marseilles and Lyons. But the Buffalo Bill show faced significant challenges during its tour in Spain, particularly in Barcelona where the situation was dire. The local population was struggling, leading the show to drastically reduce ticket prices to attract attendees. Even with lowered admission fees, the audience was sparse, and a significant portion of the revenue collected was found to be counterfeit. The counterfeit money issue was widespread, with local shopkeepers being known for their ability to detect fakes, making transactions difficult for the show. The performers, including Annie and Frank, faced not only financial hardships but also health crisis, as typhoid and smallpox outbreaks plagued the company. Despite the grim circumstances, the show continued to perform, often to small crowds of beggars and the impoverished. As Christmas approached, the performers struggled with illness, as several members of the show had succumbed to disease. Annie writes in her autobiography, "The city was stricken with the Spanish flu. We had flu, smallpox, and typhoid in camp. We lost our orator, Frank Richmond, who always presented me to royalty and gave tone to the company. One half of our people were down, but we only lost 2 more. They were Indians who died of smallpox." Yet, the spirit of the show persisted. Ultimately, the company managed to escape Barcelona. Arrangements had been made, and on the 20th of January 1890, a struggling Wild West company set sail for Naples, Italy, on a poorly equipped boat, facing significant risks. Despite the daunting conditions, including storms, they arrived in Naples, where it was but a slight improvement over Barcelona. Italy did prove to be profitable territory, however, allowing them to recover from their huge losses in Spain, performing in cities like Naples, Rome, Florence, Pisa, Milan, and Verona. They performed in ancient arenas, attracting large audiences and generated substantial revenue. The company then moved into Bavaria, where Annie had a notable encounter with Prince Leopold, the regnant of Bavaria, who was placed in charge after the death of King Otto. Prince Leopold, who gained popularity by refusing additional compensation for his role, visited the Wild West show to meet Annie Oakley. His visit was done behind the scenes, placing the grandeur that typically comes with that of royalty. During their meeting, he expressed interest in her shooting skills, examined her equipment, and inquired about her achievements in competitive shooting. The prince then asked Annie, "I would like very much to have a souvenir of your work. Do you suppose that if I should throw a coin in the air, you could hit it with a pistol?" As they walked through camp, they walked by horse tents, Indian teepees, and by where the cowboys were attempting to tame a spirited bucking horse that they named Dynamite. As the prince was flipping the coin, Annie plugged it. As the prince pocketed the coin, Annie glanced over to see Dynamite startled as the cowboy swinging into the saddle of the bucking horse. "We're in danger here," Annie said. But the prince looked and merely shrugged at the horse. Like many in Europe, they believed that the horses were just trained to do that. "I don't believe he will hurt us," said the prince. He soon changed his mind when he saw Dynamite, with a bit between his teeth, head down, shriek across the arena. Annie and the prince had no chance to react as Dynamite lunged at him and threw him off his feet as he landed on his side as Dynamite continued bucking across the arena. As the prince got to his feet and his assistants were dusting him off, he took it like a champ. Laughing, he said, "You were right, there was danger, wasn't there?" The incident was brushed aside as he resumed his conversation about Oakley's shooting prowess. The next day, he sent a lavish token of gratitude to Annie, a diamond bracelet adorned with crown and monogram of Luitpold. Vienna came after Munich, with more royalty and a meeting with the Emperor of Austria. But Annie was a bit different, and didn't see royalty as everyone else. She saw them as humans. She would write in her notes, "I felt sorry when I looked into the face of the Emperor of Austria. My husband and I were being shown through the palace one morning, and the emperor sat at a table stacked high with mail for his perusal. But somehow, he asked that I be shown to his august presence. He arose with a smile and greeted me with a real handshake, but his face looked both tired and troubled. I then and there decided that being just plain little Annie Oakley, with 10 minutes of work once or twice a day, was good enough for me, for I had, or at least thought I had, my freedom." Buffalo Bill would leave the show at the end of the 1890 season to go back to America and help with the, quote, Indian troubles. Many people will remember him as a great showman, but Buffalo Bill was more patriot, buffalo hunter, soldier, and scout than he was a showman. He served his part in the Ghost Shirt War, but returned to the show when they went to Germany in the spring of 1891. This is when Annie Oakley met the then German Kaiser, Wilhelm II. The Kaiser's interest for the Buffalo Bill show was grabbed when he saw the shooting capability of Annie Oakley, as the show traveled through Germany as he attended a few of them. This was followed by another private expedition in which Frank and Annie used some of their rifle tricks, which had Annie shooting the ashes off of a cigarette that was held in Frank's mouth. The Kaiser showed great interest in this trick in particular, and had asked Annie if she'd be willing to repeat the trick, but this time, he would hold the cigarette in his mouth. Annie said she could, and did just that as ashes toppled from the cigarette. For years afterward, Annie would congratulate herself on her good aim. That was until 1914, when Wilhelm II gave assurance of unlimited support to Austria-Hungary before the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, which sparked the start of World War I. Some uncharitable people have claimed that if Annie had just missed this one shot and hit the Kaiser instead of the cigarette, she could have prevented World War I. Though according to Mr. Cooper, she even wrote to him and asked for another opportunity for the shot. Annie Oakley had 2 more years to spend in Europe, part of which was taken up by a tour of Scotland with the show, while the remainder was again spent at the Earl's Court, where she served as an added attraction for the horticultural exhibit of 1892. Then it was back to America as the show would perform as part of the Chicago World's Fair in 1893. And this is when Cody's show truly became Buffalo Bill's Wild West and Congress of Rough Riders of the world. As Mr. Cooper writes in his biography of Annie Oakley, the performance was now filled with bolo throwers, Cossacks, Arabs, and a diverse array of riders and expedition artists from around the world. Annie Oakley continued to be the same sensation in Chicago as she had been in London and various parts of Europe. To the average person, the feats of the Little Missy were nearly unbelievable. Her name became synonymous with fame in America. It seemed that no political cartoon could achieve its peak without featuring a character dressed as a girl marksman, shooting an apple off the head of the trembling opponent. Her name represented everything in the realm of marksmanship. Stage burlesque humorously portrayed Annie Oakley as a comedic version of the girl from Dark County. Guns were designed specifically for her. She introduced the trick of shooting glass balls while riding a bicycle, and instantly, every bicycle company sought to entice her into endorsing their brand, hoping to advertise that Annie Oakley considered a particular model the only one capable of withstanding the intense demands of the arena. Recognizing Annie Oakley on the street meant that a crowd would quickly gather, trailing behind her just to catch a glimpse of the woman who had showcased her skills before European royalty. Young boys shouted her name as they attended the Wild West shows. To them, she was nearly as significant a figure as the legendary Buffalo Bill. Clothing retailers imitated her style. Annie Oakley was a staple, or as much of a staple as this country can have, in the minds of the American public. For 7 years following the World's Fair, she remained on the road with the Buffalo Bill show, observing, by the way, the gradual process that led to its decline. Naturally, this included the dissolution of the partnership between Nate Salisbury and Buffalo Bill, and the formation of a new alliance with James A. Bailey. The Colonel's lavish spending habits, such as renting entire hotel floors and his belief that money would endlessly flow to him, contributed to his financial downfall. Meanwhile, Annie Oakley and her husband, always saving, worked during the summer with the Wild West show, then participated in winter trap shooting events, where they not only had opportunities to win purses, but also receive a portion of the gate receipts. They were preparing for the day when they would no longer need to travel, and when they would have enough wealth to sustain them indefinitely. Eventually, they felt that this moment had come, and thus they announced their decision to conclude their time as performers of the Wild West show at the end of the 1901 season. One of the last performances was held, and at its conclusion, as per usual, the band played its farewell song, All the Sign, which is what you are hearing in the background right now. The show's train was loaded up and started upon its last journey of the season. As they traveled through North Carolina, a crash occurred during the night. The cries of the injured, the chaos of animals, the tearing of metal and wood, and the sound of escaping steam filled the air. The show train had collided head-on with another train, resulting in several deaths and over 100 injured. Among the injured was Annie Oakley. Frank had pulled her from the wreckage. She was unconscious as he rushed her to the hospital as she was teetering between life and death. Throughout the night, uncertainty loomed, as a, quote, watchful husband stepping at intervals to the bedside of his unconscious wife. It was said that in a matter of 17 hours, her hair had changed from heavy chestnut to white. The next day, the doctors gave Frank their prognosis. Annie would survive, but she would probably never regain the ability to move or shoot again. The little Missy that the entertainment world had adored was no more. As I am sure many of you can assume if you listen to all of this, Annie Oakley was just too damn stubborn for that to reign true. After 5 operations and 2 years of agonizing recovery, she walked out cautiously to the traps of a gun club near Nutley, New Jersey. She grabbed her shotgun, lifting it and lowering it gently, as she gazed out to the field. "Pull!" she called, as the target flew from the station. There was a blast followed by a disintegrated target. The now white-haired Annie turned, smiled, and remarked, "Just as good as ever." Annie Oakley, against all odds, was back in action. Annie Oakley would never get back to the same level when she was performing in her prime. But despite the circumstances, the always stubborn little Missy felt as though the accident was just another challenge for her. The retirement her and Frank had anticipated during their time with the show felt forced and unnatural. Through sheer determination, she managed to rehabilitate herself to a point where she could ride with a semblance of her former skill, and her shooting, with even more rigorous practice than before, somehow seemed to improve. before the shot that marked her official return to competitive shooting at the gun club near Nutley. The allure of the stage had called to her again, but this time in a play written just for her, The Western Girl. Mrs. Kasper in her biography gives the background of the play. Annie played Nancy Berry, the good daughter of a bad bandit. Her sister was blind, and the man she loved was stalwart and true, a U.S. cavalryman, Lieutenant Robert Howley. 2 soldiers, 1 miner, a Mexican dancer, and of course, a cowboy rounded out the cast. To rescue all them at sundry times, the critics explained, was Nancy's mission. She lassoed the villainess and pulled her by the neck over a yawning chasm in the mountains. The villainess fell screaming to her death in the torrent below. But the blind sister was saved, much to the delight of the audience, whom the Rochester Union and Advertiser said goes wild over the incident. Then, with her trusty gun and her good horse Bess, Nancy Berry saved Lieutenant Howley from the half-breed Lafonte. Nance wore the white hat, saved the nice people, and nipped evil in the bud. The performance debuted in Elizabeth in November 1902, before proceeding to Patterson and Atlantic City. This was a production tailored specifically for the sharpshooter, who is fondly remembered from the Buffalo Bill's Wild West show. Annie continued to don her short skirts, leggings, and sombrero, now enhanced with a curly brown wig to disguise her once dark hair, which had now turned white. She skillfully shot a bottle from her inebriated father's hand, fought her way out of a room where she had been confined, shattered 20 glass balls flawlessly, and truly embodied her Wild West persona. The Wilkes-Barre Record remarked, "Miss Oakley is clever in her role, and supported by first-class company." The play was vibrant, dazzling, and sensational, a true melodrama that captivated the audiences of that era. By April 1903, Annie Oakley was no longer performing The Western Girl, as a significant moment changed everything. While she retreated to her childhood home in Darke County in Ohio, away from the chaos of bandits, entertainers, and gun smoke in a theater, the return to a quieter environment allowed her to recover from the physical and mental toll of her past experiences. Regardless of the challenges she was facing, her health issues, and old father time, Oakley continued to showcase her remarkable shooting skills. But a stark realization struck her one morning in Nutley, New Jersey, highlighting the fleeting nature of fame and public recognition. This moment was particularly grueling for Oakley, as it encompassed not only physical pain, but also emotional stress, underscoring the harsh reality of how quickly one can fade from the public eye, even after achieving great success. A Chicago wire of a press association gave the following story, titled, "Annie Oakley Asks Court for Mercy. Famous woman crack shot whom Edward VII applauded, steals to secure cocaine." Annie Oakley, daughter-in-law of Buffalo Bill and the most famous rifle shot in all the world, lies today in a cell at the Harrison Street station, under a Bridewell sentence for stealing the trousers of a black man in order to get money with which to buy cocaine. The woman for whose spectacular marksmanship King Edward himself once led the applause in the courtyard of the Buckingham Palace, when arrested Saturday on the complaint of Charles Curtis, a black man, she was living at 140 Sherman Street. For those worried about Annie Oakley being addicted to cocaine, don't worry, it wasn't her. It was a woman named Maud Fontanella. She was a burlesque performer in a Wild West show, and she called herself Annie Oakley, A-N-Y, one of the parody performers. When she was arrested, she gave this name to the officers. The newspaper magnate William Randolph Hearst, a man who had many newspapers and a wealthy fortune, is the man who originally ran the story. Well, our Annie Oakley was angered and furious by the reports that were trying to ruin her reputation, and she proceeded to sue every single newspaper that ran the false story. Over the course of the next 7 years, she successfully won 54 out of 55 cases. Even though most of the newspapers that printed this story had relied on the Hearst article, upon learning that the story was a false narrative, they immediately retracted the false stories with apologies. Mr. Cooper writes that reporters, investigators, biographers have dug deeply into the life of Annie to find something that proves that she wasn't a woman of remarkable virtue and integrity, even stating how one defendant chose to fight with every possible weapon, believing that a person who led the wandering life of an actress in variety, the sole white woman with an aggregation of cowboys and vaqueros and western characters, a circus woman, easily could prove to be a loose, dissolute sort of human, and that the court action could be nullified by counterclaims and accusation. It has therefore raised a pool for the purpose of investigation, hired detectives, pried into every angle of the life of Annie Oakley. Mr. Cooper would even dig and try to find something, and would then go on to write. This biographer finds himself in the position of the investigators, who worked so indefatigably a quarter of a century ago. For their sole findings were that Annie Oakley was a determined little white-haired woman who since her childhood had adhered strictly to the main elements of the life of the Quaker teachings of her mother. They found that one of her favorite bits of reading matter was the Bible. They found that among the entire Wild West, every cowboy, every working man, was not only ready, but eager to fight for the honor of a woman who in the 17 years of the show never had done an illicit thing. But Annie did not make any money from this after legal expenses. In fact, she may have spent some of her own money on top of it, but it was important for her to protect her reputation that she worked so hard to garner. Annie Oakley decided against leveraging a wave of publicity that followed the unfortunate media incident, even though the press was keen to provide her with positive coverage after their own mistakes. But Annie and Frank would dedicate their efforts in participating in shooting expeditions at gun clubs, where the audience mainly consisted of sports fans, and the publicity coming from sources outside of the Chicago incidents. This period continued for several years until she felt the urge to return to the performance stage, but the industry had undergone significant changes. The Buffalo Bill Show had evolved into the Buffalo Bill Wild West and Pawnee Far East, and after facing financial struggles, they would shut down just a year later. In 1912, Oakley became part of the young Buffalo Wild West, a diminished version of the original show, but the thrill and the vibrancy of her past performances were absent. Annie Oakley was now over 50 years old and coping with the aftermath of the train accident. She found the show business less enticing than it once was, and as a result, after fulfilling her contract, her and Frank stepped away from the show business. In 1913, the couple moved to Cambridge, Maryland and built a sportsman's paradise, where Frank adopted a black, tan, and white English settler that, according to Mr. Cooper, looked at him with deep, soulful eyes. He named the dog Dave after show business friend Dave Montgomery. Before long, Dave had become, as one visitor put it, a genial member of the family. Though they enjoyed hunting and the boating, Annie could not settle down to the housekeeping. In 1916, Annie embraced a new position as a gunship instructor for women at the prestigious Pinehurst Resort in North Carolina. For 2 years, this was the ideal life for Annie. There were her horses and dogs, the duties of professor at the traps, with a professional match thrown in here and there. She would even put on shows at Pinehurst, according to Mr. Cooper. In February 1916, Annie Oakley delighted 800 persons and proved that she had lost none of her skill with firearms in an expedition at Pinehurst, North Carolina recently. With a rifle, she hit coins tossed into the air and broke marbles on the fly. She shot a cigarette from the hand of her husband, Frank Butler, and an apple from the head of her settler, Dave. With a revolver, she rolled a tin can along the ground with a tattoo of bullets on its upper crust and exploded cartridges thrown into the air. She broke a ball whirled about a man's head while she sighted by looking into the mirror, formed by the blade of a table knife. With a shotgun, Mr. Butler threw 6 balls into the air simultaneously. The woman expert, using 3 double-barreled shotguns, broke them all before they struck the ground. She would then go on to break a current record of 97 targets out of 100 at the Wentworth Gun Club in New Hampshire, when she shot a perfect 100 out of 100 targets. The period Annie Oakley spent at Pinehurst might have been the most joyful of her later years. Even though over 3,500 women arrived as beginners and left proficient in firearms, there was ample time for relaxation, leisure, and reflection. She also had time to explore the hills and valleys, go horseback riding, and hunt and train her dogs. Among them, Dave, the friendly settler, was her favorite, followed closely by Fred, named after actor Fred Stone, just like her cherished horse. On the 2nd of February 1917, Annie wrote a letter to the conning tower of the New York Tribune after one of their editors wrote a piece of Annie saying how a white-haired, picturesque feature at Pinehurst, teaching all the ladies to break glass balls with a rifle or clay pigeons with a shotgun. No longer a short-skirted, dashing girl of the plains, but a nice little old lady with spectacles and knitting. Only one thing remains, her 100% ability to break glass balls. Annie wrote in a friendly manner, as she must have liked the article, as she would keep it in her clipping book, but it gives good insight to the later life of Annie Oakley. It's titled, My Dear Mr. Conning Tower Man. What did I hear you say? She is a little white-haired lady who wears spectacles and knits? I am guilty as to the first two charges owing to two trains which tried to pass on the same track, but did not succeed. My hair turned white in 17 hours from the injuries received, and the result was 5 operations. That was in 1901, and in 1911, blood poison caused by infection from a slight operation resulted in 4 days with a temperature of 107, which affected my right eye so that the sight was impaired for reading fine print or doing fancy work of which I am very fond. Not guilty as to knitting. I graduated from knitting school at the age of 8 years. That was when I started to shoot. Since then, I have not handled the knitting needles. So your friend Mr. White could not see at close range when he mistook the embroidering for knitting. Why did I give up the arena? Because I made hay in the heyday of my youth and felt I had earned a change. Why am I teaching ladies to shoot? Well, that is my pleasure, for which there is no charge or compensation on my part. What else do I do? Go out after Mr. Renard once a week, and with the assistance of Fred, my bronco, after a 15 or sometimes 20-mile chase, we bring Mr. Fox's scalps back to Pinehurst, where my husband and I make our winter home, or arise with the sun and hie me off into the woods or fields with my beautiful dog, Dave, in quest of quail. A 12 or 15-mile trip makes me sleep and dream again of the days when I ran barefoot over the hill and dale, chasing the bees and butterflies, or climbed nimbly up a dogwood tree to pick the finest blossoms to weave into a real queen's crown, with the gorgeous wild roses fested from my head to my then little pink toes. How I love the call of the woods with their wealth of wild flowers, the hum of the bees, the sweet notes of the turtle dove, the drumming of the ruffled grouse, and the call of the bob white. It was a haven of peace to sit on the old, moss-covered logs and inhale the scent of the tall ferns. Then at sunset, a sweet-faced, white-chapped little mother, who watched, smiling, the homecoming of her little tomboy of the family. The sweet days of childhood are long past, and the dear mother sleeps at the resting place close by. Then the great fight for recognition in the arena. It was uphill work, for when I began there was a prejudice to live down. But thanks to many of our good American people, they gave me generously, both of their approval and their applause. And so I'm rather proud of your compliment in the Tribune of January 11. She was one of the few women we really loved. Thank you, Mr. Conning Tower Man, and may you give some encouraging message to others who are just beginning the great battle of life. Very truly yours, Annie Oakley. On the 10th of January 1917, William Frederick Cody, Buffalo Bill, died of kidney failure. He was buried in Lookout Mountain Park, as he had spent much of his life in the area. Annie Oakley wrote a touching eulogy about the legendary man. The entire eulogy is in her autobiography if you would like to read it. The first few lines read, William F. Cody was the kindest-hearted, broadest-minded, simplest, most loyal man I ever knew. He was the staunchest friend. He was in very fact the personification of those sturdy and lovable qualities that really made the West, and that are the final criterion of all men, East or West. On the 28th of June, 1914, World War I had begun, though the United States would not enter the war until the 6th of April, 1917. Annie's initial plan was to raise a regiment of women and wrote to President Wilson stating, I can guarantee a regiment of women for home protection, every one of whom can and will shoot if necessary. This wasn't the first time she did this either. When the Spanish-American War started on the 21st of April, 1898, she had wrote to President William McKinley on the 5th of April, 1898, quote, offering the government the services of a company of 50 lady sharpshooters who would provide their own arms and ammunition should the U.S. go to war with Spain. But both times her offer was politely declined, though Theodore Roosevelt did name his volunteer cavalry in the Spanish-American War the Rough Riders after the Buffalo Bills Wild West and Congress of the Rough Riders of the world. Annie and Frank traveled camp to camp displaying their shooting feats. It was their way of helping with the Great War. Annie and Frank also gave their time to the National War Council of the Young Men's Christian Association, the War Camp Community Service, and the Red Cross. Dave, their dog, became the Red Cross dog by sniffing out donations or cash hidden in handkerchiefs. When the war came to its conclusion, Annie and Frank felt that they had made a well enough life for themselves in terms of wealth. Therefore, when they competed in shooting competitions, it was only for the purpose of charity. Annie's last great performance, in front of a huge crowd, came at a show in Mineola, Long Island, New York, for the benefit of the Occupation Therapy Society of New York. The organization was created to help in the rehabilitation of war veterans. Annie would still have smaller expeditions, but the huge stage, the big crowds, and the big performances had come to an end. In November 1922, Frank and Annie were traveling near Daytona, Florida, when their car flipped. Though Frank and Annie would survive, Annie would receive serious injuries. Doctors said that her fate had finally been sealed. At 62 years old, a fractured hip, the tendons in her right leg being pulled so badly that it required a steel support brace. These were the barriers that stood between little Missy and the sound of a gunshot that she cherished so much. Doctors claimed that she would never be able to fire a gun again. Annie would state, "But they've said that before. I've been near death 4 times in my life, and the good Lord had always pulled me through. He'll pull me through this time too. I'll shoot again and I'll be as good as ever." During the spring training season, a touching scene came at Cook Field in Leesburg, Florida, as Annie Oakley made a remarkable return to shooting. Accompanied by a gentleman who assisted her due to her frail condition, as she slowly walked to the table with the help from her crutches, Annie smiled and stated, "You know, I haven't had a gun in my hand since the 8th of last October." As she steadied herself on her left leg, a group of young boys watched in awe, eager to witness this little old lady they called Little Sure Shot. With a steady hand, Annie took aim and a penny was tossed up. The crack of a rifle and the ping of a penny shortly followed. She would repeat this shot 25 times in a row. Then came larger discs from a greater distance, and concluded when Annie tossed 5 eggs into the air at once and shot them all before they hit the ground. Annie exclaimed, "I knew I would be able to shoot again." It wouldn't be the last time either. Over time, Annie's health continued to get better as she no longer needed crutches, relying instead on a steel brace around her right leg. As her health increased, so did her shooting skills. She would break the club record at the Mayview Manor Gun Club in Blowing Rock just 18 months after her accident, shooting 98 out of 100 clay pigeons. But the expeditions eventually decreased. Slowly, letters of encouragement started to reach Annie Oakley, who is now residing in Dayton, Ohio, close to the places she had experienced in her youth. News traveled to her sister, Holdy Haynes, her brother, John Moses from Oklahoma, and her supportive niece, Fern Campbell from Detroit, informing them that she was confronting her final target. In the summer of 1926, according to Mrs. Kasper, Frank and Annie moved back to Darke County, staying near Asonia with Bonnie and Rush Blakely. Rush Blakely would say that Annie's health wasn't too good. She got tired awful easy, said it was anemia. Frank wasn't too good either. Frank wanted to go south for the winter, as the warm air he believed would do them both good, but Annie refused and told him to go without her. With a heavy heart, Frank left because he believed it was what Annie wanted, and he wanted to please her. In October, Annie received a visitor named Louise Stalker. Her father ran a funeral home in Greenville, and in modest Annie fashion, she only wanted a woman to handle her body. She had items laid out, pictures, souvenirs, mementos, and in between sheets of neatly placed tissue paper was an apricot-colored dress of fine Jornet silk. Annie said that this was the dress she wanted to wear during her funeral service. The dress was only half-hemmed, so Stalker took it and completed it. At 11 o'clock in the evening on the 3rd of November, Annie Oakley, Little Missy, Little Sure Shot, the woman who against all odds became the most famous woman marksman of the world, tragically passed away at the age of 66. Annie Oakley filled out her own death certificate. Name, Annie Oakley Butler. Occupation, expert marksman. Cause of death, pernicious anemia. Her beloved husband, the couple that everyone idolized for their strength, their love, and their resilience, died just 18 days later on the 21st of November, 1926 in Michigan. Butler was buried next to Annie in the Brock Cemetery in Greenville, Ohio. Annie sent Fred Stone, whom she named a dog and her cherished horse after, a box before her death. From the Times New York newspaper, Fred Stone opened yesterday afternoon a sealed box sent to him by Annie Oakley, champion markswoman, who died on November 3rd last at the home of a relative in Greenville, Ohio, at the age of 66. Miss Oakley gave the box to a neighbor, Hazel Grote, shortly before she died, with instructions that it be sent to Mr. Stone and opened only after her death. The box was opened on the stage of the Globe Theater in the presence of Raymond Bratter, notary public, Arthur Houghton, the star's manager, Miss Dorothy Stone, his daughter, and a group of newspapermen. It was a heavy, brown pasteboard box and was found to contain several scrapbooks with clippings of the markswoman's career in Europe and America, numerous snapshots and photographs, and a typewritten autobiography of her career up to 1890. All were carefully tied up and labeled. There was no letter of explanation, but Mr. Stone said it was evident that Miss Oakley, whom he had known for more than 20 years, they appeared in a circus together years ago, intended that he should act as their literary executor. Mr. Stone said he would be glad to have the material used in a biography of the noted rifle shot, either as a book or in a magazine article. Annie Oakley led a remarkable and fulfilling life. Despite starting with very little and enduring a difficult childhood, she found true love in Frank and remained devoted and faithful to him. She achieved great fame, becoming one of the most recognized figures in both the marksman and showman arenas. Time and again, she generously supported those in need, offering both financial assistance and her time. Her legacy continues to inspire countless women to pursue their dreams, and she will forever be celebrated as one of the greatest sharpshooters in history, never to be forgotten. Before I end this series, I wanted to cover some common questions and popular topics, quotes on Annie Oakley. Did Annie Oakley make her own costumes? Yes, she did. She would decorate and sew her own costumes because she didn't want to be seen as a woman of loose morals because of her religious beliefs. She wanted to be seen as modest and ladylike. She would sew on flowers and ribbons on her skirts. She learned this skill as a child when she stayed in the infirmary. Why did Annie Oakley never spoil herself with clothes or anything else? Annie wrote, "People have asked me, but why do you give as you do? Why do you not spend more on yourself? If I spend $1 foolishly, I see tear-stained faces of the little children beaten as I was." Did Annie and Frank ever have children? Annie and Frank did not have children of their own, but Frank did have children from a previous marriage. But they did cherish their nieces and nephews, writing them often and showering them with gifts. Annie, in her will, made special mention of her sisters Emily, Hulda, and Ellien, and her brother John, as well as made specific gifts for their nieces Fern, Bonnie, and Irene, along with their great nieces and nephews. Was Annie inducted into a Hall of Fame? Yes, she was actually inducted into several Hall of Fames. The Trap Shooting Hall of Fame, the National Women's Hall of Fame, the Ohio Women's Hall of Fame, the New Jersey Hall of Fame, and the National Cowgirl Museum and Hall of Fame, just to name a few. Are there any movies on Annie? She was portrayed in countless movies, shows, theater acts, anything you can think of. She is throughout popular culture. Some examples: Annie Oakley, 1935. One of the most popular that has ever been made into all sorts of acts, Annie Get Your Gun. TV series Annie Oakley from 1954 to 1956. Even Reba McEntire portrayed Oakley in Buffalo Girls, 1996, and later in the revival of Annie Get Your Gun in 1999. Annie talked about her belief of why women should know how to shoot, writing, "I believe every woman should learn how to shoot. It would give them confidence and power of self-protection. And above all, it would teach them grace and poise. You cannot imagine how shooting demands perfect balance, and how shooting vanishes carelessness in slovenly ways. I know nothing better in securing grace than practicing the poses, which must be done in successfully handling a rifle or shotgun." How many women did Annie teach how to shoot? She writes, "As I have taught nearly 15,000 women how to shoot, I modestly feel that I have some right to speak with assurance on the subject. Individual for individual, women can shoot as well as men." And finally, Annie was tired of answering the same questions over and over, so she put together the answers for 10 questions that, quote, "I am asked every day." They are called her facts and fancies. Number 1. I was born in Woodland, Ohio, which is now called Willowdale, Ohio. Number 2. I learned to shoot in the field. Number 3. I do not think I inherited my love of firearms from my parents, for they were Quakers and were very much opposed to my using such weapons. 4. Having traveled in 14 countries, and having hunted in almost all of them, I have shot nearly all kinds of game. 5. While I love to shoot in the field, I care very little for expedition shooting, and only do it as a matter of business. 6. I never use the word champion in connection with my name, and always request my friends not to address me as such. 7. My guns weigh about 6 pounds each, and are of many different makes. There is no such thing as the best gun maker. The best gun is the gun that best fits the shooter. 8. I use pistols, rifles, and shotguns. To me, the use of a cheap gun is like driving star pointer with a clothesline. You never know when the line is going to give way. 9. I like pigeon shooting when the birds are first-class flyers, but I am very much opposed to shooting pigeons from the trap during the 3 summer months. 10. I use 39 grains of Schultz smokeless powder and 1 ounce of shot loaded to UMC smokeless shells. I don't say that is the only load, but it is good enough for me. As we bid farewell to Annie Oakley, we remember not just her remarkable talent as a sharpshooter, but also her indomitable spirit and unwavering dedication to her craft. She broke barriers and inspired countless individuals, especially women, to pursue their dreams fearlessly. Annie's legacy will forever resonate in the hearts of those who admire her courage and passion, reminding us that true strength lies in the pursuit of one's passions and the impact we leave on the world. One last quote from Annie herself. "Aim at a high mark and you'll hit it. No, not the first time, nor the second time, and maybe not the third. But keep on aiming and keep on shooting, for only practice will make you perfect. Finally, you'll hit the bullseye of success." I think things like this is what makes history so interesting. For 100 years, we all believed that the story of Annie Oakley was the truth. All the things we talked about, her childhood, how she met Frank, and about the long-told shooting match, how she started as a shooter, all of it. Then through diligent research, we find new information that completely changes the story. I hope you'll enjoy this special episode on Annie Oakley. If you did, please give it a like and maybe subscribe if you feel so inclined. It goes a long way towards helping this podcast grow, and I appreciate it greatly. Thank you all for your support. As always, please join me on Patreon. You'll get access to episodes 1 week early, and as always, access to some bonus episodes that are only available on Patreon. Please email me with comments, questions, concerns that you may have, and I will get back to you quickly. wildwestdeepdives@gmail.com. Lastly, another huge thanks to the Annie Oakley Center for all their help. They are an amazing group, and I feel very thankful that they brought me into the museum, and Ellien made me feel very welcome. And thank you Ellien, Karen, Brenda, Cathy, and Don, who helped me tremendously in putting this together with the correct info. Go check out the Garst Museum in Greenville. You won't regret it. We will see y'all next time. When in doubt, shoot straight, shoot fast. God bless.